Welcome back to Soft History Stories. Imagine a river at night. Not a wild river, not a mountain river, white with stone and hurry. Imagine a slow river, an old river, a river so wide and so patient that in the dark you cannot see the far bank at all. Only a band of deeper black where the water ends and the night begins. Imagine the smell of it, wet mud and reeds and date palms, the warm exhalation of a land that has been farmed for longer than any other land on earth. Imagine the sound of it, the small lap of water against brick quays, the creak of a moored boat, somewhere far off a dog, somewhere far off a song. This is the Euphrates, on a summer night 26 centuries ago, and on its banks, spreading away into the dark in every direction, lamp by lamp, wall by wall, tower by tower, is the largest city in the world. Its people call it Babel, the gate of the god. We call it Babylon. You have heard the name your whole life. It is one of the oldest words that human beings still say. It is in the songs you half remember and the books your grandparents read. It is a byword and a warning and a dream. The hanging gardens, the tower that reached for heaven, the writing on the wall, one of Babylon, the rivers of Babylon, the confusion of tongues. The name has been borrowed and bent and reused so many times by so many people who never saw it that the real city has almost vanished beneath the knit legend of itself, buried, you might say, under a second city built entirely of stories. And tonight, slowly, gently, with all the time in the world, we are going to dig down through that second city to reach the first. We are going to walk the real streets of the real Babylon, its blue gate and its straight processional way, its temple tower climbing in 7 stages toward the stars, its markets loud with 70 languages, its scribes pressing wedges into wet clay, its astronomers on the rooftops writing down the positions of the planets night after night, for centuries until they had, without quite meaning to, invented science. But this is also a story about time and about how much of it there is. Because Babylon is not a single city in a single age. Babylon is a place that human beings lived in, and rebuilt and ruled from, and fought over for more than 2,000 years. Which is to say, Babylon was already more ancient to Alexander the Great than Alexander the Great is to us. When the city reached the height we will spend tonight describing, the blue-walled wonder of the world, the Babylon of the King Nebuchadnezzar, it was already standing on the rubble of a dozen earlier Babylons, the oldest of which had been old when the pyramids were young. We are looking at the top layer of a mound that goes down through 1,500 years of human living before it reaches the river mud. There is no end to the depth of this place. That is the first thing to feel as you settle into the dark, that you are lying at the lip of an almost bottomless well of time, and we are going to lower a lamp into it slowly and watch the centuries glimmer past as it descends. You do not need to remember any of it. That is the gift of the hour. The kings will come and go, and their names, Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, Belshazzar, will move past you like boats on the dark river, and you do not need to hold on to a single one. They did not hold on either in the end. That is partly what the story is about. Let the names be water. Let the dates be water. Let the whole patient flood of it carry you where it has carried everyone who ever heard it, which is down and under and away. So we begin where every traveler to ancient Babylon began, not inside the city, but outside it on the road at evening, with the walls rising ahead. And the walls of Babylon, you should understand, were not walls as you picture walls. They were one of the wonders of the ancient world, listed by the Greeks who made such lists, among the very greatest things human hands had made. The historian Herodotus, who claimed to have seen them, said the outer wall was wide enough at the top to turn a 4-horse chariot, and that 100 gates of bronze pierced its length. Modern scholars argue about his numbers. Herodotus was a magnificent storyteller and not always a careful surveyor, but the archaeology that remains is staggering enough. A double wall of baked and unbaked brick, a moat of river water, ramparts and towers without number, enclosing a space so vast that the Greeks could scarcely believe a single city filled it. To approach Babylon at dusk was to watch a man-made mountain range assemble itself out of the haze of the plain and then set into that dark immensity to see the one thing no traveler ever forgot. A gate that glowed blue. We will come to that gate in time, and stand beneath its dragons, but let it hang there for now, at the rim of the dark, a single point of impossible color in the gathering night. The thing the traveler saw first, and remembered last, the blue threshold of the greatest city in the world, waiting for us at the far end of a road that runs back through 2,000 years. There is no hurry. The gate has stood through every night for 26 centuries of telling. It will still be glowing when we reach it. Before we pass through the blue gate, and we will, we have all night to pass through it. We must understand the land that made Babylon possible, because Babylon is, before it is anything else, a triumph of mud and water over a near impossible place. Look at the land in your mind. Run your eye from the mountains of the north, where the snow feeds the springs, down across a flat, brown immensity toward a warm sea in the south. Two great rivers cross this flatness, side by side, born in the northern mountains, running down through the plain toward the sea. The Tigris in the east, swift and unpredictable, and the Euphrates in the west, broader and gentler. Between them and around them lies a long tongue of land that the Greeks would one day name with a single beautiful word. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the southern half of it, the flat, hot delta where the two rivers wander toward the sea, is the place where, as those who have kept other vigils with this channel know, the very first cities on earth were built by the people we call the Sumerians more than 5,000 years ago. Babylon is their heir. Everything Babylon is, it inherited from 1,000 years of Sumerian civilization that came before it. The writing, the gods, the temples, the very idea of the city. We will honor that inheritance through the night, because Babylon herself honored it. Her scholars kept Sumerian as a sacred dead language 1,000 years after the last Sumerian had died. The way medieval Europe kept Latin, the way we keep the names of the constellations. But the land is the thing to understand first, because it explains everything that follows. The wealth, the engineering, the gods, even the fear. This southern plain is by nature a hard place to love. It almost never rains. The summer heat is murderous, a furnace wind off the deserts to the west and south. The land has no stone for building, and no timber for roofing, and no metal of any kind in the ground. It has in fact almost nothing, except two things, and those two things are everything. It has the rivers, and it has mud. From the mud, the people of this plain made everything. They had no stone, so they made stone. They cut the river clay into bricks and dried them in that ferocious sun until they were hard as rock. And where they needed them, harder still, for the great walls and gates, they fired them in kills until they rang. Whole cities, whole civilizations, palaces and temples and ziggurats climbing toward heaven, all of it shaped from the silt the rivers laid down. The land, quite literally, building itself upward into towers, and they wrote on the mud too. Pressed reeds into wet clay tablets to make the wedge-shaped marks we call ununiform, then dried them. And by that simple act, mud, reed, sun, they invented the first writing, and kept the first records, and wrote the first laws and letters and poems and star charts, hundreds of thousands of which survive today, baked hard and unburnable, while the libraries of papyrus and parchment of every later age have crumbled into dust. The driest, poorest, most stoneless land in the ancient world became the best documented because it wrote on something that fire cannot destroy and time cannot fade. There is a lesson hidden in that, somewhere about what lasts, but it is late, and we will let it lie. And from the rivers they made the rest. For the rivers, though they almost never sent rain, sent water, too much of it at the wrong time. The Tigris and Euphrates flood in the spring when the northern snows melt, which is exactly when the grain is ripening, and a flood is the last thing a farmer wants. And they run low in the autumn when the new crop needs watering most. The rivers left to themselves are a curse with the timing of a curse. To make them a blessing, the people of the plain had to seize control of the water itself, to dig canals to carry it where it was needed, dikes to hold it back when it raged, basins to store it against the dry months, sloughs to let it out drop by measured drop. And this could not be done by one family, or one village, or even one town. It required thousands of people working together under direction year after year, generation after generation, cleaning the canals of silt, mending the dikes, settling the endless quarrels over who got the water and when. It required, in a word, organization on a scale the world had never needed before. And organization on that scale is the thing we call the state. Kings, officials, scribes, tax collectors, soldiers, priests. Civilization in this corner of the earth was born in a sense from the simple backbreaking, eternal problem of moving water across a flat, hot plain. Babylon, the gate of the god, was built on mud and floated on a network of canals, a city, you might say, that the rivers grudgingly allowed to exist, on the strict condition that its people never ever stop digging. Hold that bargain in your mind as you drift, because it runs under the whole story like the water table under the plain. Everything magnificent about Babylon, and it was magnificent beyond the dreams of its neighbors, stood on an agreement with the rivers that could never be relaxed and never be won, only maintained one more season and then one more. The gardens hung green because someone every single day lifted the water. The fields fed 100,000 mouths because the canals ran clean. And when at the very end of our story, Babylon at last falls silent and empties and returns to the mud, it will not be an enemy that does it. Not really. It will be the slow winning of the rivers, the salt creeping up through the overwatered soil, the canals silting closed, the water going its own way at last across the flatness, indifferent, patient, home. But that is the end, and we are at the beginning. And between them lie 2,000 years and the greatest city of the ancient world. So let the river run in the dark beside you, and let us go back now, back past the blue-walled wonder, back past even the Sumerians who built the first cities, to the moment this particular city, among all the cities of the plain, first whispers its name out of the silence of the clay. Before we leave the land itself, and begin the long climb through the centuries, let us walk it once slowly, as a living place, not as the stage of kings, but as a country of its own, full of its own creatures, and its own weathers, and its own particular beauty. For the people of Babylon did not live in a history book. They lived in a real landscape, under a real sky, among real animals and plants. And to feel that landscape is to come closer to them than any wall or law can bring us. Begin in the south, in the marshes, where the two great rivers, sluggish and silt-heavy at the end of their long journey, spread out before the sea into a vast labyrinth of reed and water and shifting island that has no true edge. The marshlands, one of the great wetland wildernesses of the ancient world, a country of its own, where a distinct people lived as their descendants lived until almost our own day, in houses woven entirely of reed, beautiful arching halls built without a single nail or beam, made holy from the giant reeds that grow there taller than a man. People who moved by slender boat through channels in the reed beds, who fished and fowled and herded water buffalo, who lived half on water and half on floating islands of matted reed that they built and rebuilt. The marsh was a place of teeming life, wild boar, and the reed thicket and fish in uncountable abundance. And above all the birds, vast clouds of waterfowl, ducks and geese and herons and cranes and pelicans, rising and settling over the water in the thousands, hunted with throwing stick and net and arrow, a paradise of fowling. The reed was everything here. House and boat and basket and mat and pen and fuel, and the very stylus that wrote the civilization's words. There is a deep rightness in that, to hold that the script which kept the memory of the world was cut from the same reed that built the houses of the poorest marsh-dweller. The whole towering edifice of Mesopotamian civilization, written quite literally with a piece of the marsh, move north, up onto the irrigated plain proper, and the land changes. The green ribbon of cultivation along the canals and rivers intensely worked. The date palms in their groves, the barley fields stretching flat to the horizon, the villages of mud brick, the network of waterways glinting. Here were the domestic animals on which life depended, the sheep, above all, in their great flocks. For wool was the plain's chief manufacturer and export, spun and woven by the 1,000 hands of the cities into the textiles that clothed the Near East, and goats, and cattle for plough and milk and meat, and the patient donkey, the universal beast of burden, and the onager, and later the horse, prestige animal of kings and warriors, and the camel coming in from the southern deserts with the incense trade, and the pig in the villages, and the dog at the door, and the cat, and beyond the green, always pressing at its edges, the other country, the dry steppe and the desert, the realm of the herders and the raiders and the wild things, where the gazelle ran in herds and the wild ass, and where in the scrub and the reed margins and the riverside thicket lived the great predators that haunted the Mesopotamian imagination, the wolf, and above all, the lion, for Mesopotamia was lion country, and the lion runs all through its art and its terror and its kingship, the lion that took the herdsman's sheep, and sometimes the herdsman, the lion of the goddess Ishtar, pacing the blue walls of the processional way, the lion that the king hunted in great ritual hunts, to prove his power to protect his land, shone on the palace reliefs pierced with the royal arrows, dying with a terrible carved nobility that has moved viewers ever since. The land was full of danger and full of life, scorpions and snakes among the perils against which the people prayed and wore their amulets, locusts that could darken the sky and devour a harvest in a day, a recurring terror, and the great weathers of the plain, the murderous summer heat, the dust storms that rolled in like walls of brown night, the precious brief floods, the rare and blessed rain, and over all of it, the enormous sky, the clear, dry sky of the plain, in which the stars burned with a brilliance that city dwellers of damper lands can scarcely imagine, the sky that made the astronomers possible, night after cloudless night for 1,000 years, to stand on that plain at evening as the heat broke and the light went long and gold across the flat land, the palms black against the afterglow, the canals shining, the birds going home to the marsh in their thousands, the first great stars pricking out in a sky that went on forever, the smell of water and dust and woods, and the river. That was the world the people of Babylon actually lived in, the real and breathing country beneath all the history. The land they loved and feared and worked and sang about and were buried in. It is still there, in its bones. The rivers still run, though changed. The marshes drained and ruined, and now painfully reviving, still hold their reedhouses and their birds. The sun still goes down gold across the flat land where the greatest city in the world once stood, and is now a low brown mound among the fields. The empires came and went like weather. The land remained and remains, patient, ancient, breathing, the true and lasting body of the story, the plain between the rivers, under the enormous star-crowded sky going on. Babylon did not invent itself, and it never pretended otherwise. One of the most appealing things about the Babylonians, a people we might otherwise imagine as merely proud and grasping, is the depth of their reverence for the civilization that came before them, the civilization they inherited and never stopped honoring, the Sumerians, the people who, on this same plain, more than 1,000 years before Babylon rose, did the most extraordinary thing any people has ever done. They invented civilization itself. Those who have kept other vigils with this channel know their story, and we will not retell it whole tonight, for it is a long tale and its own. But we cannot understand Babylon without standing for a moment on the Sumerian foundation beneath it. For very nearly everything we have called Babylonian was in its origin Sumerian, handed up across 1,000 years like a flame passed from torch to torch. The cities themselves, the very idea of the city, thousands of people living together behind walls, governed and fed and organized. The Sumerians built the first ones on earth, Uruk and Eridu and the rest, when the rest of humanity still lived in villages. The writing, the wedge, and the reed and the clay was theirs first. Babylon wrote a different language in the script the Sumerians made, the gods. Many of the great gods Babylon worshipped were Sumerian gods under new or old names, and the temples and the ziggurats and the rituals descended from Sumerian practice. The literature, the epics, and the laws and the proverbs and the hymns. The very epic of Gilgamesh began in Sumerian and was inherited, translated, treasured by Babylon. The mathematics, the base 60 counting that gave us the hour and the circle, the irrigation engineering, the kingship, the temple economy, all Sumerian first, all inherited, and the Babylonians knew it, and honored it in a way that is genuinely moving. They kept Sumerian alive as a learned and sacred language for well over 1,000 years after the last native speaker had died. Exactly as medieval and modern Europe kept Latin, a dead tongue preserved because it carried the prestige of an admired and foundational past, Babylonian scholars studied Sumerian, compiled great dictionaries, translating it into their own Adean, copied and recopied the ancient Sumerian classics, conducted their most solemn rituals in the old dead holy language, whose every syllable was thick with antiquity. To be learned in Babylon was in large part to be learned in Sumerian, to have access to the deep past, the original wisdom, the foundational texts of the world. Babylon, the city that the legend imagines as the very type of arrogant novelty, the upstart wonder, was in fact a profoundly conservative, backward-looking tradition revering civilization, forever conscious of standing on the shoulders of a greater and older age, forever copying and preserving and honoring the achievements of ancestors 1,000 and 2,000 years dead. There is a humility in that, beneath all the blue glaze and the boasting, a sense which the Babylonians never lost, that they were the heirs and keepers of something far older than themselves, something they had not made and could only tend and pass on. And this gives the whole story its true and staggering depth of time, which is the thing above all to carry into sleep. When we marvel that Babylon was ancient to Alexander, we have not gone deep enough. For Babylon's own golden age was already looking back across more than 1,000 years to the Sumerian dawn. The way we look back to the fall of Rome and the Sumerian dawn itself reached back into a past of villages and the first farmers that was already unimaginably old. The plain between the rivers was the place where layer on layer the human race first did almost everything it learned to do, first farmed in earnest, first built cities, first wrote, first kept records and laws and accounts, first watched the stars with method, first wrote down its dreams and fears and stories. And Babylon was the great inheritor and keeper of all of it, the librarian of the oldest human achievements, the city that held the deep past in trust. That is why its fall feels so large, and why its name carries such weight. When Babylon at last fell silent and sank into the mud, and the script went dark, it was not one city that was lost, but the living memory and the living voice of the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. 3,000 years of accumulated human invention, falling quiet at last, waiting in the clay for someone someday to learn again how to read it, and to hear, rising faintly from the mud, the oldest things the human race ever thought to write down. We cannot understand Babylon, or anything that came out of the plain between the rivers, without pausing to honor the strange and beautiful technology on which all of it rested. The technology that the people of this land invented before any other people on earth, and that more than the walls or the gardens, or even the laws, is the true foundation of everything. Writing, it began, as the deepest things so often do, with accounting. More than 5,000 years ago, in the old Sumerian cities, the temples and the early rulers needed to keep track of things, of how much grain came in and went out, how many sheep, how many jars of oil, how many days of labor owed, and to remember it. At first, they used small tokens, clay shapes standing for goods sealed in clay envelopes. And then someone in a leap whose author we will never know, but whose gift we use every day, realized that you could simply press a mark into the surface of the clay to stand for the thing, and skip the token altogether. And so the first written signs were born. Pictures of things pressed or scratched into wet clay, a head of grain, an ox's head, a fish, pictographs. And then, slowly over centuries, two world-changing things happened to those pictures. First, they stopped being drawn and started being pressed, made with the wedge-shaped end of a cut. Reed stamped into the clay, in combinations of wedges faster to make, and more abstract until the little pictures dissolved into the arrangements of wedge strokes we call cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge, and second, the truly epical leap. The signs stopped standing only for things, and started standing for sounds. The sign for an object came to represent the spoken syllable of its name, and once a sign could stand for a sound rather than a thing, you could write anything that could be said, not just lists of grain, but names, verbs, prayers, poems, laws, letters, the whole of human language. Writing had been born. The first writing in the history of the world. On this plane, in this clay, with this reed, everything written since, every book, every letter, every line on every screen, descends in the deep history of the idea from a Sumerian accountant pressing a reed into mud to remember how much barley was in the temple store. Babylon inherited this gift and made it its own. The Babylonians wrote their own Semitic language, Adian, in the cuneiform script, borrowed from the Sumerians, and they kept Sumerian itself alive as a sacred and scholarly tongue, the Latin of their world, learned and copied long after no one spoke it. And learning to write was a labor for uniform, was fishly difficult. Hundreds of signs, each able to stand for several different sounds or several different words, depending on context. A system that took years of brutal schooling to master. We know a great deal about that schooling because the schools naturally wrote about themselves, and because the exercise tablets of the pupils survive in their thousands. The school was called the Eda, the tablet house, and a boy sent there, for it was mostly boys. The sons of scribes and officials and merchants, though some women did learn to write, and a few became scribes themselves, faced years of copying. He copied sign lists and word lists and proverbs and classic texts over and over, on round clay tablets, his teacher's model on one side and his own wobbling attempt on the other. While stern masters supervised with a quick resort to the cane, one marvelous surviving text, an essay we call School Days, has a schoolboy recount his miserable day. He was caned for talking, caned for standing up without permission, caned for poor handwriting, caned for sloppy Sumerian, and then describes how his desperate father invited the teacher home, flattered him, fed him, and pressed a gift of silver and a fine garment into his hands, whereupon the teacher, suddenly delighted, praised the boy lavishly, and promised him success 4,000 years ago. And there it is, whole and recognizable. The struggling pupil, the harsh school, the anxious parent, the quiet gift to the teacher, the human comedy of education, entirely unchanged. The boy who wrote that or copied it sat in a hot mud brick room in Mesopotamia, pressing wedges into clay with aching fingers, and his complaint reaches us across 4 millennia, as fresh as if he scratched it yesterday, because he wrote it on the one thing that does not burn, or fade, or rot, the patient clay of the plain, which kept his bad day for us, as faithfully as it kept the laws of kings. This is the deep miracle under the whole story, and it deserves to be felt fully at least once before sleep. That an entire civilization, the oldest on earth, speaks to us directly, in its own words across 4,000 and 5,000 years, not through the guesses of archaeologists or the legends of enemies, but in its own voice, because it wrote and wrote on clay, and the clay survived. We have their laws and their letters, their contracts and their love poems, their prayers and their curses, their school exercises and their shopping lists, and their complaints about bad copper, their epics and their lullabies. No other ancient civilization left so vast and so intimate a record of itself, and it is all because of the wedge and the reed and the mud, the humblest writing materials imaginable. A cut stick and a handful of river clay, which together preserved more of the human past than all, the gold and marble of every other ancient land. Babylon's true monument is not the Blue Gate. It is the 500,000 tablets in the museums of the world still being read, still giving up their secrets. The largest surviving voice of the deep human past, speaking from the mud, in wedges of grain and gods and goring oxen, and the bad day a schoolboy had 4,000 years ago. When does Babylon begin? It is a harder question than it sounds, and the difficulty is itself part of the story. For most of the cities we tell of, there is a founding, a moment, a hero, a wandering people who arrive and settle and raise the first wall. Babylon has no such moment that anyone remembers. It does not arrive. It accretes. It begins the way a sandbar begins in a slow river, a little at a time, almost without anyone noticing, until one day there is something there that was not there before, and no one can quite say when it came. The first time the name appears in writing, it is already an aside, a small town mentioned in passing in the records of greater places, a name on a tax list, a dot on the vast map of Sumerian and Akkadian cities that already crowded the plain when Babylon was nothing around 4,000 years ago, perhaps a little more. The wedge marks first spell it out. Babila, Babilim, the meaning of the older name now lost until the people of the plain, hearing in it the sound of their own words, reshaped it into something they understood. Babilim, the gate of the god, the gate of the gods. And that reshaping, that folk poetry working on a forgotten syllable, is the first, truly, Babylonian thing about Babylon. Before it was a great city, it was a pun, a misheard word made holy. For its first few centuries, Babylon is nobody. This must be said plainly, because the legend insists on a city eternal and supreme, and the truth is humbler and stranger. While the great old Sumerian cities of the deep south, Uruk, Erdu, Lagash, names with the weight of 1,000 years already on them, rose and fell, and wared and built their ziggurats. Babylon sat upstream on its stretch of the Euphrates, a minor town in the shadow of its elders, unremarkable, unrecorded, waiting. It had no famous temple, no ancient dynasty, no claim on the imagination of the plain. If you had stood in the streets of Mighty, in the age of its last great kings, and someone had told you that 1,000 years hence the whole world would say the name of Babylon, and would have half forgotten the name of, you would have laughed, was a metropolis, with a sky-touching ziggurat, and a sea trade reaching to distant lands. Babylon was a name on a list, and then the empire that ruled them all. The great kingdom centered on the last flowering of purely Sumerian power collapsed. It collapsed the way these things collapse, slowly, then, all at once. The bureaucratic machine that had counted every sheep and every measure of barley across the whole south seized and broke. The outer provinces fell away. Famine came, recorded in letters of rising desperation, the price of grain climbing, the messengers begging for help that never arrived, foreign peoples pressed in from the western deserts, herders called the Amorites, Westerners whom the settled city people regarded as half-wild, people who, the snobbish scribes complained, did not know grain, did not bury their dead properly, ate their meat raw, lived in tents, and as the old Sumerian order died, these Amorite newcomers did what newcomers so often do. They did not destroy the civilization they entered, they moved into it. They took its cities, learned its writing, worshipped its gods, married its daughters, and within a generation or two were ruling as kings in the old style, signing their names in the old script, more Babylonian than the Babylonians. One such Amorite family seized the little town of Babylon around 1900 years before the Common Era and made themselves its kings. They were at first exactly as minor as their city, local lords of a second-ranked town, hemmed in on every side by older and stronger rivals, scrabbling for a few canals and a few fields, sending nervous diplomatic letters to more powerful neighbors. For 5 generations, the dynasty of Babylon ruled almost nothing, and achieved almost nothing worth the clay it was written on. They are names in a king list, little more. And then, in the 6th generation, in the year we would call 1792 before the Common Era, the throne of this small, unremarkable city passed to a young man whose name would outlast every empire of his age, whose laws schoolchildren would recite 4,000 years later, whose carved image would hang in the halls of a museum, in a country he could not have imagined, on a continent he did not know existed. His name was Hammurabi, and with him the gate of the god begins, at last, to open. We must be careful with Hammurabi, because the temptation is to make him a thunderbolt, and he was not a thunderbolt. He was something rarer, and in the long run more dangerous to his rivals. He was patient. When he came to the throne, Babylon was one of perhaps a dozen kingdoms of roughly equal weight, contending for the plain, and by no means the strongest. To the south lay the old, rich, proud city of Lhasa, ruling the ancient Sumerian heartland. To the north, up the Euphrates, lay the powerful kingdom of Mari, a glittering palace state whose archives, thousands of letters recovered by archaeologists and read by us, with the guilty intimacy of people reading another's mail across 4,000 years, give us our clearest window into the cutthroat diplomacy of the age, and looming over everything. To the east, beyond the Tigris, lay Elam, an ancient power with its own language and its own gods, rich in the metal and stone the plain lacked, accustomed to treating the kings of Mesopotamia as quarrelsome younger brothers to be played against one another. One famous letter from the Mari archive captures the whole world Hammurabi was born into. In a single line, a minister wrote to his king, "There is no king who is mighty by himself. 10 or 15 kings follow Hammurabi of Babylon. The same number follow Rimsin of Lhasa. The same follow the king of Eshnunna. The same follow the king of Katna. And 20 kings follow the king of Yamhad." It is a snapshot of a balance of power, a handful of great players, each dragging a tale of lesser allies, each watching the others, each one move away from disaster. For the first 30 years of his long reign, Hammurabi played that game like everyone else, cautiously, locally, building canals, repairing temples, fortifying towns, fighting small wars, and making small gains, biding his time inside the balance. 30 years, a whole working lifetime, by the standards of the age, spent as one player among several, doing nothing that would have earned him more than a line in history. If he had died in his 30th year on the throne, we would barely speak his name. The patience is almost unbearable to contemplate. It is the patience of a man who has decided something in private, and is willing to wait half a lifetime for the board to arrange itself. And then, around his 29th and 30th years, the board arranged itself. The great eastern power Elm overreached, invaded the plain, threatening everyone, and in doing so, frightened the squabbling kingdoms into a momentary unity. Hammurabi joined the alliance against Elam, helped break the invasion, and then, with Elam beaten back, and the alliance his purpose served, he did not go home and resume the old patient balance. He turned on his allies in a breathtaking sequence of campaigns compressed into just a few years. After 3 decades of waiting, he fell upon Lhasa to the south, and took the whole ancient Sumerian heartland, turned north, and shattered Deshnunna, and finally marched on his old friend and ally, Mari, the glittering palace. Kingdom up the river took it, and then a couple of years later, for reasons we can only guess, had returned, and pulled its great palace down, burning the archives that by the accident of that burning baked hard, and survived to tell us the story. By the end of his reign, the dozen kingdoms were one kingdom, and the one kingdom was Babylon, and the plain between the rivers. For the first time, united under a king who ruled it from the gate of the god, was the thing that later ages would call Babylonia. But Hammurabi is not remembered, in the end, for the conquests. Conquerors are common. The plain produced one every few generations, and most of their empires died with them, as in fact Hammurabi's would very nearly do. He is remembered for a thing he made near the end of his life, when the wars were won, and the kingdom was his. A thing made not of conquest, but of words carved into a pillar of black stone, taller than a man, polished smooth, and covered top to bottom in close columns of beautiful archaic writing. At the top of the pillar, carved in relief, 2 figures, a seated god, the sun god Shamash, lord of justice, flames rising from his shoulders, holding out the rod and ring that are the emblems of right rule, and standing before him, hand raised to his mouth in a gesture of attentive reverence, the king. And below that image, in nearly 300 laws, The king set down for all time what justice was to mean in the land between the rivers. We call it the Code of Hammurabi, and to that black pillar, and the strange and vivid and sometimes terrible world that glows up out of its laws like a lamp held to a window, we will turn when we have caught our breath. For in those 300 laws, more than in any war or conquest, the real Babylon first becomes visible. Not the legend, but the living city with its surgeons and its boatmen, its tavern keepers and its runaway slaves, its honest builders and its cheating ones, its wives and its widows, and its drowned and its debts. A whole world pressed into stone by a patient man near the end of a long life who wanted to be remembered as something better than a conqueror who wanted his own words say to be remembered as a shepherd. The Black Pillar stands today in a museum in Paris, in a quiet gallery where the light falls on it, the way lamplight once fell on it in a Babylonian temple. It is made of diorite, a hard, dark stone that the plane did not possess, hauled from far away, polished until it holds the light like deep water. It was not, despite its modern name, the first law code of the ancient world. There were older Sumerian collections of laws, fragments of which survive, and Hammurabi drew on a long tradition. Nor was it, despite what is sometimes said, a working law book that judges consulted day to day. Babylonian judges seem to have decided cases on custom and reason, and the pillar is barely cited in the thousands of surviving records of actual trials. It was something stranger and grander than a statute book. It was a monument. It was a king's argument, addressed to the gods and to posterity, that he had ruled justly. A thing set up in a temple so that in Hammurabi's own ringing words, the wronged man who has a case might come before my image, the king of justice, and have my words read to him, and understand his rights, and let his heart be at ease. And it is precisely because it is a monument, and not a dry statute book, that it is so extraordinary to read. Because to argue that he ruled justly, Hammurabi had to show justice in action, case by case. And so he gives us, without meaning, to a teeming portrait of his world. The laws are written in a beautiful concrete if-then form, each one a tiny story. If a man does this, if a woman does that, if the wall falls, if the boat sinks, if the ox goes, to read them in order is to walk down a Babylonian street with every door standing open. Open the doors. Here is a surgeon, and the law tells us he works in bronze and is paid in silver, and that if he saves a rich man's life with his bronze knife, he earns a handsome fee, and a poor man's life a smaller one, and a slave's life smaller still. But that if his knife kills a free man, his own hand may be cut off, so that the trade of healing in Babylon carried in its very price list the shadow of the gallows. Here is a builder, and we learn that if he builds a house so badly that it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. And if it kills the owner's son, then the builder's son shall be put to death. A justice of dreadful symmetry. The famous principle that the punishment must mirror the crime. An eye for an eye, a life for a life, a son for a son. Here is a boatman hired to carry grain down the canal, and the law fixes his wage and his liability if the cargo is lost. Here is a tavern keeper, and she is a woman for the keeping of taverns and the brewing of beer in a Babylon were largely women's trades, and the law watches her closely. She must not water the beer and overcharge on pain of drowning. She must not let rebels gather in her tavern and plot without reporting them on pain of death. Here is a woman seeking divorce, and a man seeking it, and the law parcels out the dowry and the children and the house with a care that surprises those who expect the ancient world to be simply brutal to women. For a Babylonian wife could own property, run a business, sign contracts, divorce a cruel or neglectful husband, and keep her dowry, and a widow could not simply be cast out. The world of the pillar is hierarchical and harsh, layered into the free, the dependent, and the enslaved, with the value of a life rising and falling by rank. But it is not lawless, and it is not random, and at its heart carved in the stone is an idea that would echo down 40 centuries, that even the king is beneath the law. that he holds his power from the God of justice, and answers to him for its use, that the strong shall not oppress the weak, and that the whole point of a crown is to protect the man who has no other protection. Walk a little further down the street of the laws, and the world only grows richer and stranger. Here is a case of a lost ox, and the law lays out with grave care how a man who finds straying livestock must proclaim it, and how the true owner reclaims it, and what becomes of the finder who quietly keeps it. For in a world of herds and open country, the straying and the stealing of animals was a constant of life, and the law walks through it step by patient step. Here is an adoption, and the law of it is tender and exact. For adoption was common and serious in Babylon, a childless couple taking a son, a craftsman taking an apprentice as a kind of son to learn his trade, and the law guards the bond on both sides, so that the adopted child who denies his new parents may be punished, but the parents who cast off a child they have raised owe him his due. Here is a deposit gone wrong, a man who left goods with another for safekeeping, and now cannot get them back, and the law summons witnesses and weighs the oath, for in a world without banks or vaults, the entrusting of property to a neighbor was a web of risk that the law had to hold together. Here is a runaway slave, and a man who harbors one, and the law is harsh, for slavery ran through everything, and the law protected the owner's property and human beings without apology. And yet here too, in the same code, is the provision that a slave might marry a free woman, and that their children would be free, and that a debt slave must be released after a fixed term of years. Small fractures of mercy and complication running through the hard stone. Here again and again is the oath before the God, and the ordeal by water. For when there were no witnesses and no proof, the accused might be thrown into the sacred river, and if the river held them, they were guilty, and if the river gave them back, they were innocent, the judgment handed to the God of the water. When human judgment failed, each law a tiny open door, each door a whole life behind it. The entire teeming, quarreling, trading, marrying, thieving, grieving population of the plain, caught in the amber of the black stone 4,000 years ago, and held there legible to this hour. Linger here a moment in the half-light on the surgeon and the builder, and the woman with her bier, because they are the real treasure of the night, more than any wall or garden. We will spend hours soon on the marvels, the blue gate, the seven-stage tower, the green terraces in the desert air. But the marvels are what Babylon built to be remembered by, and the laws are what Babylon was without meaning to be remembered at all. Through them, we are not looking at how Babylon wished to appear. We are looking at how Babylon actually lived, at a real plain full of real people 4,000 years ago, buying and selling and marrying, and quarreling and healing and cheating and building under a hot sky beside a slow river, watched over by a patient king who told them in stone that their small disputes mattered, that the law would hear them, that even the goring of an ox by a neighbor's bull was worth the attention of the gate of the God. There is a tenderness hidden in the harshness of that pillar, a king near the end of his life, reaching across the centuries he knew were coming to say, "This is how we lived, and we tried in our way to be fair." Hammurabi died around the year 1750, before the Common Era, an old man, master of the plain, having ruled for 42 years. And here the legend would like the story to saw the founding of an eternal empire, the unbroken glory of Babylon. The truth, as ever, is humbler, and in its way, more moving. Almost the moment he was gone, his empire began to come apart in his son's hands. This is the pattern of the plain, and we should learn it now early, because we will see it again and again through the long night, like a tide that comes in and goes out and comes in again. A strong king, by force of will and a lifetime of patience, gathers the cities of Mesopotamia into one hand. He dies. The cities which have their own ancient identities, and their own gods and their own grudges, begin to pull away. The provinces revolt. The marsh people of the deep south secede. New enemies test the weakened center. Within a generation or two, the great unified kingdom has shrunk back to a city and its hinterland, and the plain is divided again, waiting for the next patient man. Hammurabi's son fought rebellions his whole reign and held things together. His grandson held less, and the dynasty dwindled, century by century, ruling an ever smaller Babylon, until the city was once more a regional power among regional powers. Its days of mastering the plain, a fading memory carved on an old black stone in a temple. And then, around the year 1595, before the Common Era, a century and a half after Hammurabi, something happened that no one on the plain could have predicted. A thing that came out of the north, like weather, a king of the Hittites, that mountain empire of Anatolia, whose story those who keep vigils with this channel will remember. The empire rediscovered in the very land from which these words reach you, led his army hundreds of miles down the Euphrates, far beyond any normal campaign, in a raid of astonishing reach, and fell upon Babylon and sacked it. He did not stay. He could not, so far from home. He stripped the city, seized its sacred statue of the god Marduk, and the carrying off of a city's god was the deepest wound one ancient people could deal another, for it meant the god had abandoned his city and then marched all the way home again, leaving Babylon broken behind him. The dynasty of Hammurabi, already a shadow, simply ended. The Hittite raid is one of the strangest events of the age, a bolt from a clear sky, and it closes the first great chapter of Babylon's story. The city that Hammurabi had raised to the mastery of the world was 4 generations after his death, a plundered town whose very god had been carried into captivity in the mountains. What followed was a long, dim, quiet age, 4 centuries and more, in which Babylon almost disappears from our sight, not because nothing happened, but because so little was written, or so little has survived. Into the power vacuum came another people, the Kassites, mountain folk from the east, who, and here is the pattern again, the deepest pattern of the whole story, did not destroy Babylon, but became Babylonian. They took the throne, kept the language, served the gods, restored the temples, retrieved at last the kidnapped statue of Marduk, and gave the plain something it had rarely known: stability. For more than 400 years, a span longer than the entire history of many famous empires, longer than ancient Athens and Rome's republic combined, the Kassite kings ruled a peaceful, prosperous, deeply traditional Babylon, and we know them mostly through the courteous letters they exchanged with the other great kings of that brilliant age, the pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of the Hittites and Assyria and Mitanni. Letters found far away in Egypt, in which the king of Babylon addresses Pharaoh as "my brother," haggles politely over gold and marriage alliances, and complains in the eternal voice of the slighted dignitary that the gifts sent in return for his daughter were not nearly fine enough. It is a glimpse of Babylon at rest, not conquering, not falling, simply being an old, rich, respected kingdom in a club of great powers, growing slowly, more ancient and more venerable, banking the prestige it would draw on for the rest of its existence. For this, too, is how a city becomes eternal in the imagination, not only by blazing, but by simply stubbornly lasting, by being there century after century when the brighter flames have gone out. We have spoken of conquests, Hammurabi taking the plain, the Hittite raid, the rise and fall of empires, but we have not yet looked closely at the thing that made and unmade all those empires, the hard machinery of war as the people between the rivers practiced it. And we should for an hour, in the dark, because the wars are the tide that moves the whole story, and because the soldiers who fought them were as real and as frightened as any of us, and left their traces in the clay alongside the poets and the brewers. War on the Mesopotamian plain was shaped like everything by the land, flat, open, crossed by rivers and canals, with cities as the great prizes, each ringed by its mighty walls. And so warfare here became above all 2 things: the clash of armies in the open and the long, grim business of the siege. In the open field, the early armies of Sumer had fought as dense blocks of spearmen, shoulder to shoulder, behind a wall of shields. The phalanx in embryo with the king and his nobles in the prestige weapon of the early age, the battle cart, a heavy 4-wheeled vehicle drawn by onagers, lumbering and slow, more a mobile platform and a terror than a true chariot. Over the centuries, the technology transformed. The coming of the true horse and the light, fast-spoke wheeled chariot, revolutionized war across the whole Near East. And the chariot became the dread arm of the great age of empires, a fast-moving platform for an archer, sweeping across the flat plain, raining arrows, breaking infantry, the tank of the Bronze Age, expensive and aristocratic and decisive. The composite bow built of horn and wood and sinew gave range and power undreamed of by the simple bow. Bronze gave way in time to iron, cheaper, harder, more abundant, and iron weapons armed the mass infantry of the later empires. Above all the terrible armies of Assyria, the soldiers carried spear and bow and sword and sling. They wore, the richer of them, helmets and armor of bronze scales or leather. They marched behind their gods whose standards and images went with the army to lend it divine power. But it was in the siege that Mesopotamian warfare reached its dreadful height, for the cities were walled as nowhere else. And to take an empire you had to take its cities. The Assyrians, above all, became the supreme masters of siegecraft in the ancient world, and their palace reliefs carved in stone meant to terrify and impress. Show us the whole grim art in vivid detail, the great siege engines, wheeled towers and battering rams with armored housings pushed up against the walls under covering fire, the sappers undermining the foundations, digging beneath the walls to collapse them, the scaling ladders and the storming parties, the archers and slingers sweeping the battlements, the defenders on the walls hurling down stones and fire and chains to catch the rams. And then when the wall was breached or the gate broken, or the starving city surrendered, the reliefs show the aftermath with a pride that still chills the blood across 26 centuries. The executions, the impalings, the flayings, the heads piled in heaps, the long lines of captives and deports, driven out into exile, with their bundles on their backs, and their children on their shoulders. The loot carried off, the city burned. War on the plain was not glorious. It was at the sharp end as brutal as war has ever been, and the records do not hide it. The kings boasted of it, carved it on their walls, recited it in their inscriptions, made terror itself a weapon, the calculated demonstration of what resistance would cost. And yet, for this too, the clay preserves. Behind the boasting kings and the carved atrocities were the ordinary soldiers, the levied farmers, and the professional spearmen. And their war was the war of every common soldier in every age. Long marches under a punishing sun, hunger and thirst and disease, the terror of the assault, the loss of friends, the longing for home. We have letters, soldiers writing home, officials worrying about supplies and pay and desertion, the endless logistics of feeding and moving an army across a land of canals and distances. We have the laws that govern soldiers' lives, Hammurabi's among them, protecting the soldier's land and family while he was away on campaign, punishing the officer who cheated his men, providing for the ransom of the captured. A glimpse of the state's bargain with the men it sent to die, 4,000 years old, and entirely recognizable. The soldier of Babylon, marching out through the blue gate behind the standard of Marduk, spear on his shoulder, was not so different from the soldier of any later age. Frightened, far from home, hoping to come back, trusting his God and his king and his comrades, doing the hard and ancient and terrible thing that human beings have asked of their young men, since the first cities raised the first walls and the first armies came to throw them down. The walls and the wars built the empires and broke them in their long tidal rhythm across the Lethe. And under every wall stormed and every empire fallen were these men, and their fear and their letters home kept for us in the clay alongside the lullabies and the recipes and the songs. The whole human truth of it, the glory and the horror and the homesickness, together pressed into the patient mud of the plain. To understand the Babylon that everyone remembers, the blue-walled, gold-roofed wonder of the world, we must first understand the shadow that hung over it for the better part of 5 centuries, the rival that nearly extinguished it, and against whose darkness Babylon's last and greatest flowering must be seen, the way a lamp is brightest in the deepest dark. That shadow had a name, and the name was Assyria. They were the same people in a sense. Assyrians and Babylonians both spoke dialects of the same language, wrote the same script, worshipped versions of the same gods, read the same ancient Sumerian classics. They were the northern and southern branches of a single Mesopotamian civilization, as alike and as unalike as two brothers who have grown to hate each other precisely because they share a face. Babylon lay in the south, on the flat alluvial plain, an old city of priests and merchants, and scholars proud of its antiquity, conscious of being the cultural heart of the world. Assyria lay in the north, a harder country of rolling hills and real seasons, and stone in the ground centered on its own ancient cities, Ashur on the Tigris, and later the great capitals of Kalhu and Dor-Sharakin, and at the last, the mighty Nineveh, and where Babylon's genius was for culture and commerce and contemplation. Assyria's genius, honed by a position with no natural defenses, hemmed by enemies on every side, was for war. No state of the ancient world made itself so completely into an engine of conquest as Assyria did, in the centuries of its greatness. It built the first true standing professional army, paid and drilled and permanent. It mastered iron weapons, siege engines, battering rams, and siege towers, and the systematic undermining of walls. It built roads to move armies fast, and a relay of messengers to carry word faster. And it wielded terror as a deliberate instrument of policy, recording its own atrocities, not with shame, but with pride, carving them in stone on palace walls, and boasting of them in royal inscriptions meant to be read aloud. Cities burned, populations flayed, skulls piled in pyramids before the gates, whole peoples uprooted from their homelands, and marched hundreds of miles to be resettled among strangers, a policy of mass deportation pursued on a scale not seen again for thousands of years. The point of the horror was efficiency. A people who knew what Assyria did to those who resisted were a people who might with luck not resist. For 3 centuries, the kings of Assyria ground outward in every direction, until their empire reached from the mountains of Iran to the Mediterranean coast down into Egypt itself, swallowing kingdom after kingdom, including along the way the small, troublesome kingdoms of the Levant. The kingdom of Israel, whose 10 tribes of Syria deported into a disappearance so total that they live on only as a legend, the lost tribes and other vanished people, the records remember and the world forgot. And Babylon, the ancient venerable south, fell into the lengthening Assyrian shadow. The relationship was tortured, and it is worth feeling its peculiar agony, because it explains so much of what came later. The Assyrians did not despise Babylon the way they despised their other victims. They revered it. Babylon was the holy city, the seat of Marduk, the source of the very civilization the Assyrians themselves practiced. Assyrian kings studied Babylonian texts, copied Babylonian literature, worshipped Babylonian gods, and longed to be seen as the legitimate protectors of the sacred southern city. And yet they also needed to control it, to dominate it, to rule it. And Babylon, proud beyond reason of its antiquity, would not be ruled by the upstart northerners it regarded as cultural children. So century after century, the two were locked together in a terrible embrace. Assyria conquering Babylon and then trying to plate it, ruling it directly, and then setting up puppet kings, courting it and crushing it by turns. And Babylon submitting and then rebelling, accepting Assyrian kings, and then rising against them the moment Assyria looked weak, always conscious that it was the elder, the holier, the truer heart of the world, no matter how many armies the north could field. It was a hatred between near equals, sharpened by kinship and by religion, and it would not end until one of the two cities lay in ashes. The breaking point came in the 7th century, before the Common Era, under the most powerful Assyrian king of all, a man named Seneca. And the story of what he did and what it cost him is the dark hinge on which the whole rest of continues. Babylon's history turns. Sennacherib inherited the eternal Babylonian problem. The holy city would not stay quiet. It rebelled and was put down and rebelled again. backed by Assyria's enemies to the east, harboring rebels, slipping its leash again and again. Sennacherib tried the usual remedies: direct rule, a puppet king, even installing his own son on the Babylonian throne. The son was captured by Babylon's allies and carried off, never to return. And at last, Sennacherib, a hard man, pushed past the edge of patience, resolved on a thing that horrified even the Assyrians themselves: not to punish Babylon, but to erase it. In the year 689, before the Common Era, his armies took the holy city, and on his order set about its systematic destruction. They massacred, they looted, they tore down the temples and the walls and the houses. They threw the rubble into the canals. And then the detail that echoed through the ancient world as an act of almost unthinkable sacrilege. They opened the dikes and turned the waters of the Euphrates over the ruins, so that the site of Babylon, the gate of the god, the oldest and holiest city of the world, became a drowned marsh. Sennacherib boasted of it in his inscriptions, that he had destroyed the city more completely than a Tixi, that he had made its site unrecognizable, that he had carried its very soil away to distant lands so that nothing would remain. It was, in the cold logic of Assyrian terror, a triumph, and it was, in the deeper logic of that age, a catastrophe for its author, because to destroy the city of Marduk, to drown the holy place, to scatter the gods, was a crime against the order of the cosmos itself. And everyone in Mesopotamia, very much including the Assyrians, believed it. When Sennacherib was murdered some years later by his own sons in a palace intrigue, struck down, the accounts say, in a temple, the whole world read it as the judgment of heaven, the destroyer of Babylon, cut down by his own blood before his own altar, paying the price of sacrilege. His successor, his son Esarhaddon, took the throne under that shadow and made it one of the first great projects of his reign to undo his father's crime, to rebuild Babylon, to restore its temples, to bring back its gods, to proclaim in long pious inscriptions that the city's destruction had been the will of the offended gods, and its restoration their mercy. A remarkable spectacle of a conqueror, son spending the wealth of an empire to resurrect the city his father had drowned. Babylon rose again from its marsh, rebuilt by the very dynasty that had destroyed it, more potent in the imagination now than ever, for it had been killed and had come back. A city that can be drowned and rise again is no longer merely a city. It is beginning to become a symbol, and in that rebuilt, restless, unkillable Babylon, in the generation that followed, a man was waiting whose ambition was about to change everything. He was a Babylonian governor, a Chaldean, one of the Aramaic-speaking tribal peoples who had settled the southern marshes over the preceding centuries, and who now formed the stubborn core of Babylonian resistance to Assyria. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, and he looked at the Assyrian Empire in his old age, vast, dreaded, stretched from Egypt to Iran, seemingly invincible. And he saw, where everyone else saw a mountain, a thing that was top-heavy and tired and ready, with one hard push from the right direction to fall. He was about to give that push, and out of the fall of Assyria, in a single astonishing generation, would rise the Babylon of legend at last, the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. The story of how Assyria fell is one of the great reversals of ancient history, and it deserves to be told slowly, in the dark, because for those who lived through it, it was very nearly the end of the world. And because out of its ashes came the golden city we have been climbing toward all night. Nabopolassar rose in revolt in the south around the year 626, before the Common Era, seized Babylon, and had himself crowned king, the first king of a free Babylon in a very long time, the founder of the dynasty that historians call the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire. For a decade and more, he fought the Assyrians up and down the plain, winning and losing, never quite strong enough to break them alone. Assyria was wounded, torn by its own succession struggles, exhausted by a century of overreach, bleeding from a dozen frontiers at once. But a wounded Assyria was still the most formidable military machine on earth, and Babylon alone could not bring it down. What brought it down was an alliance, and the alliance came from the east, from beyond the Tigris, from the mountains of Iran, where a people we call the Mes, an Iranian people kin to the Persians, who would later inherit everything, had forged themselves into a kingdom under a king named Sax. The Mes had their own ancient grievances against Assyria, and their own hard mountain armies, and when Babylon and Media made common cause against the dying giant, the giant's hour had come. In the year 612 before the Common Era, the combined armies of the Mes and the Babylonians closed upon Nineveh itself. Nineveh the Great, the Assyrian capital, the largest city in the world, the seat of the kings who had terrorized the earth for 3 centuries, the city whose palace walls were carved with the agonies of 100 conquered peoples. They besieged it, they stormed it, and they destroyed it so utterly that it became, like Babylon before it under Sennacherib, a synonym for total ruin. The fallen city, the lesson written in fire that all the proud should read. The Hebrew prophet Nahum, who hated Assyria as only her victims could, sang over the ruins of Nineveh, a song of terrible joy. "Woe to the bloody city," he cried. "She is empty and void and waste." And within a generation, the greatest empire the world had yet seen had vanished so completely that 2 centuries later, when a Greek army marched past the overgrown mounds of the Assyrian cities, they had no idea what they were looking at. The ruins were already anonymous, the name of Assyria already passing into the legend of the lost. An empire that had made deportation and erasure its instruments was itself erased, root and branch, by the peoples it had wronged, in a single furious generation, and almost one person's, Matagenia. Nothing of it was remembered until the spades of the 19th century lifted the carved kings out of the Media, it's again, blinking into a world that had forgotten they ever ruled. Stop here for a moment in the quiet after Nineveh, because this is one of the great hinge moments of the whole human story, and it is worth feeling its weight as you drift. For 300 years, the people of the Near East had lived under the shadow of Assyria, the way later ages lived under other shadows, as a permanent, dreadful, seemingly eternal fact of the world. And then, in the space of a few years, it was simply gone, and the children born after were born into a world without it, a world remade. The spoils of that vanished empire, its provinces, its tribute, its trade routes, its place at the center of the map, fell to be divided between the 2 victors. The Mes took the north and the east, the mountains and the Iranian plateau. And Babylon, free Babylon, ancient Babylon, the holy city drowned and risen, took the rich south and west, all of Mesopotamia, and the great curve of fertile land, running up the Euphrates and down the Mediterranean coast through Syria and the Levant, the lands of Armens and Phoenicians, and the small stubborn kingdom of Judah, with its temple city of Jerusalem. Overnight, the rebel kingdom of the marshes had become an empire, heir to Assyria's wealth and Assyria's reach, but ruled now from the gate of the god by a dynasty that meant to make their ancient city not merely great, but the single wonder of the world. Nabopolassar laid the foundations, restoring the temples, beginning the great rebuilding, but the work of raising Babylon to its legend would fall to his son, a prince already proving himself a soldier of genius in his father's wars, a man whose name more than any other is the name we mean when we say Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar II. The name is a Hebrew rendering of the Babylonian Nebu Kaduri user. O God Nebu, protect my firstborn son, came to the throne of Babylon around the year 605, before the Common Era, and ruled for more than 40 years. And in those 4 decades, he did something that almost no conqueror in history manages. He won his wars, and then he spent the peace and the wealth and the long years, not on more wars, but on building this magnificent city the world had ever seen. He is remembered rightly as the greatest of all Babylonian kings, but the surprising truth, the thing the legend tends to bury, is that he is remembered less for what he destroyed than for what he made. The Bible remembers him as a destroyer, and we will come to that, for it is a true and terrible part of his story. But the clay of Babylon itself, the thousands of bricks and inscriptions that survive, remembers him overwhelmingly as a builder, as a king almost obsessed with construction, who stamped his name on millions of bricks, who left inscriptions that read less like the war, boasts of a conqueror, than the proud reports of an architect. I built, I raised, I made splendid, I caused to be wondered at. The wars came first, and they were real. As crown prince, Nebuchadnezzar had won the decisive battle that broke the last Assyrian resistance and its Egyptian allies, securing the Western Empire for Babylon, the Battle of Kish, a name that the prophets of Judah noted with dread, for it meant the new giant of the north now reached all the way to their doorstep. As king, he spent his early years securing that Western Empire, marching again and again into the Levant to hold the coast and the trade routes against the rival pull of Egypt. And it was in the course of these Western campaigns that Nebuchadnezzar collided with the small kingdom of Judah and did the thing for which half the world would remember him for the next 2,500 years. We will tell that story: the siege of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the carrying of the people of Judah into exile by the rivers of Babylon in its own hour, soon with the care it deserves, because it is one of the most consequential events in the history of the world, and because it is the single thread by which most people today still hold the name of Babylon at all. But hold for now only this, that to Nebuchadnezzar himself, the conquest of Judah was a minor frontier affair, one rebellious hill kingdom among many, brought to heel, barely worth a line in his own inscriptions, and that the same king who, in the memory of one deported people, became the archetype of the destroying tyrant, was in the memory of his own city, and in the testimony of the earth, the great patron, the restorer of temples, the planter of gardens, the king who made Babylon bloom. Both are true, the same hands. This is one of the quiet, hard lessons the night keeps offering, if you are still awake to hear it, that the man who is a catastrophe in one people's story is a golden age in another's, and that history, which we like to imagine as a single tale with heroes and villains, is really a vast braid of tales that contradict each other, all of them true, none of them complete, and that the only honest place to stand is where you can hold more than one of them at once, in the dark, without forcing them to agree. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed a temple in Jerusalem and built 100 in Babylon. He carried one people into weeping exile and raised for his own people a city so beautiful that its very name became another word for the world's lost glory. He was a destroyer and a builder, and he was the same man. And now let us go and see the city that he built. So let us at last, after all these centuries of climbing, walk into the city. It is night, of course. It is always night in this hour, and we are approaching from the north along the road that every pilgrim and merchant and ambassador took, the road that runs toward the most famous entrance in the ancient world. And there, rising out of the dark, lit by torches and by the moon, is the thing that no one who saw it ever forgot: the Ishtar Gate. You must throw away first every gray and brown picture of the ancient world you carry, because the Ishtar Gate was blue, not painted blue, glazed blue, the deep luminous lapis lazuli blue of fired and vitrified brick, a blue that did not fade in the sun or wash away in the rare rain, a blue made to last forever, and very nearly has, the whole great double gateway, its towers rising perhaps 12 meters and more, was sheathed in thousands of these glazed bricks, a blue so intense and so deep that in the torchlight it must have seemed less like a wall than like a piece of the night sky brought down to earth and stood on end at the entrance to the city. And across that field of blue in rows, marching in solemn procession up the towers and along the walls, were animals molded in relief, raised from the surface, glazed in white and tawny gold, so that they stood out against the blue, like figures in a dream. There were bulls, the animal of the storm god Adad, and there were dragons, the Mush-Hushu, the serpent dragon of Marduk himself, a marvelous composite beast with the scaled body and neck of a serpent, the 4 legs of a lion, the hind legs of an eagle, a crest and horns, and a forked tongue, pacing in eternal procession across the blue. Bull and dragon, bull and dragon, hundreds of them climbing the gate in ranks, gold on blue, lit by fire, at the threshold of the largest city on earth, to pass beneath them into the city of Marduk, must have been one of the supreme experiences the ancient world had to offer, and Nebuchadnezzar knew it, and built it for exactly that effect. For he wrote of this very gate that he had made its thresholds wondrous, and set up bulls and citrons, and adorned it with luxurious splendor, for all mankind to behold in wonder. The gate was propaganda, of course. Everything a king builds is propaganda. But it was propaganda of a very high order, propaganda that became simply beauty. Much of that gate survives. This is one of the small miracles of our story. When German archaeologists excavated Babylon in the early 20th century, they recovered enough of the glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate to reconstruct it. And a version of it stands today, blue and gold and dragon marched, rebuilt to its full towering height inside a museum in Berlin, where you may walk beneath the dragons of Marduk in the cool northern light. 26 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar set them there, to be wondered at by all mankind, he got his wish in a way he could never have imagined. They are still being wondered at. They are being wondered at, in a sense, right now, by you in the dark. As you picture them, the blue, the gold, the slow procession of the dragons climbing toward the stars. Through the blue gate ran the great street, and it was as deliberate a wonder as the gate itself. They called it Aya Shabu, a name that has been translated beautifully as "May the enemy not cross it." The processional way, the sacred road along which once a year, at the great spring festival, the statue of the god Marduk himself was carried in triumphant procession through his city. The street was wide and straight and paved, and the paving was a marvel. Great slabs of limestone and red breccia fitted together, and on the underside of each slab, where no human eye would ever see it, where only the God and eternity would know, Nebuchadnezzar had caused to be inscribed his name and a prayer, so that every footstep on the sacred way fell, unknowing, on a buried benediction. The walls that lined the processional way were glazed blue, too, like the gate, and along them, at the level of a walking man, marched another procession of molded beasts. Not bulls and dragons this time, but lions, 60 of them, perhaps more. The lions of the goddess Ishtar, white and yellow against the blue, manes bristling, jaws open, pacing the whole length of the street toward the gate, so that to walk into Babylon along the sacred way was to walk a gauntlet of glazed lions, blue and gold, with the dragons of the gate rising ahead, and the Tower of the God climbing beyond, a single, vast, coordinated work of art and architecture and faith, designed to take the breath of anyone who entered, and to leave them in no doubt that they had come to the center of the world, and around all of it ran the walls that the Greeks would count among the wonders of the world. We spoke of them at the very beginning of the night, rising out of the dusk. Now we are inside them, and can feel their true scale. The inner city was ringed by a double line of fortification, an inner wall and an outer wall, each many meters thick, studded with towers, fronted by a wide, water-filled moat fed from the Euphrates, so that an attacker faced first the moat, then the outer wall, then a killing ground, then the inner wall, a defense in depth that the engineering of the age could scarcely hope to breach. Herodotus, gazing on them a century or so later, reported the famous detail that the walls were broad enough at the top for a 4-horse chariot to drive along, even to turn. And whether or not his measurements were exact, the impression was true. These were not walls so much as an artificial mountain range, a man-made horizon, enclosing a city so large that the Greeks struggled to describe it, and resorted, as travelers do, to numbers no one could check. Nebuchadnezzar himself, in inscription after inscription, returns again and again to these walls with the pride of a man who knows they are his masterpiece of security. I surrounded the city with a great wall, he writes. I dug its moat. I built its rampart mountain high, so that the onslaught of battle should not reach Babylon, so that my city should be unconquerable. Hold those words gently, because they are going to matter terribly at the end of our story. Unconquerable. He believed it. and he had every reason to. The walls of Babylon were, by every measure the age possessed, impregnable. The city would fall anyway, not because the walls failed, but because of something. The walls were never built to stop, but that is for the deep of the night. For now the walls hold, the lions pace, the gate glows blue, and we are inside in the largest, richest, most marvelous city on the face of the earth, and there is so much more still to see. Pause with me, before we climb the tower, on the most overlooked wonder of all. Not any single building, but the sheer engineering intelligence that raised an entire metropolis. Gates and walls and temples and palaces, and a tower toward heaven, out of a land that offered its builders nothing but water, reeds and dirt. Think again of what the plain did not have. No stone to quarry. The nearest building stone lay far away, hauled in at enormous cost, only for the most special purposes. No timber worth the name. A few palms, but nothing for the great beams a monumental architecture needs. Cedar and other good wood had to be imported from distant mountains across hundreds of miles. No metal in the ground at all, by every measure of what we usually think a great building civilization requires. The southern plain was destitute, and out of that destitution, the people of Babylon built one of the architectural wonders of the world, which means they had to invent or perfect an entire architecture based on the one thing they had, in endless supply: mud. The brick was their stone, and they made it in two grades. For ordinary building, houses, the cores of walls, the bulk of everything, they used mud brick, clay mixed with chopped straw, pressed into wooden molds, and dried hard in the relentless sun. Cheap and quick, and serviceable, but vulnerable to water, slowly dissolving in the rare rains and the rising damp, which is why Babylonian buildings needed constant repair, and why abandoned they slumped so readily back into the earth. And for the parts that mattered most, the facing of great walls, the gates, the temple platforms, anything that had to endure or to shine, they used baked brick fired in kilns until it was hard and durable as stone and nearly as lasting. Far more expensive because it devoured precious fuel and so reserved for the monuments. The Ishtar Gate, the processional way, the casing of the ziggurat, baked brick, fired hard, and then for the greatest of them, glazed, coated with mineral pigments, and fired again until the surface vitrified into that imperishable lustrous blue. And to bind the bricks, they used bitumen, natural asphalt, tar, which seeped from the ground in parts of Mesopotamia, a black sticky pitch that the Babylonians used as mortar and waterproofing, sealing their walls and their boats and their bathing rooms against the water, brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. The Bible's account of the tower builders catches it exactly in a line that betrays an author who knew the real construction methods of the plain. They had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. Slime, bitumen. The detail is true. Whoever wrote it had seen how Babylon was built, and with these humble materials, sun-dried mud, kiln-fired brick, river reed, and black bit, they achieved astonishing things. They raised double city walls thick enough, the legend said, to race chariots along. They built palaces with great courtyards and throne rooms faced in glazed brick. They constructed the vated substructures that may have held the hanging gardens and the big, elaborate waterworks that fed the city and may have lifted water to those gardens' heights. They managed with only mud brick and reed and bitumen the immense hydraulic engineering of the canals and dikes and basins that we spoke of at the very beginning. The network on which the whole civilization floated, requiring constant calculation and maintenance, the moving of water across a dead flat land with no natural fall to help. And they raised the ziggurat, the man-made mountain, stage on stage, with a baked brick skin over a mud brick core, climbing toward the sky. All of it from dirt and water and reeds and tar. There is a kind of genius in this that is easy to miss because it is so humble in its materials. The genius not of abundance, but of constraint. The deep cleverness of people who, given almost nothing, looked at the mud under their feet and the reeds in the marsh and the black tar seeping from the ground, and built from them the greatest city in the world. The pyramids are stone, and we marvel rightly. But there is an argument that Babylon, raising comparable wonders out of mere dried mud, in a land with no stone at all, performed the greater feat of engineering imagination, making a metropolis, quite literally, out of the ground it stood on. The river's own silt shaped and dried and fired and glazed and stacked toward heaven. The land built itself upward into towers, and then, when the building stopped, it slowly lay back down, brick dissolving into the mud it came from, until the wonder of the world was once more a low brown mound beside the river, indistinguishable from the plain that made it. Earth, that had briefly gloriously been persuaded to stand up and be a city, lying down again to rest. At the heart of Babylon, visible from everywhere in the city, and from far out across the flat plain, rising above the rooftops, and the palm groves, and the blue gate itself, stood the thing that more than any other has burnt the name of Babylon into the human imagination. The great tower, the ziggurat, the temple mountain of Marduk, called Etamani, a Sumerian name, kept sacred across the millennia, meaning the foundation house of heaven and earth. A ziggurat was not a temple in the way we usually mean, not a building you entered to worship in. It was a mountain made by hands, a vast, stepped pyramid of brick, stage upon receding stage, with a small shrine at the very top, built to lift that shrine up out of the flat world and toward the sky, toward the dwelling of the god. The plain had no mountains, and the gods, everyone knew, loved the high places. So the people of the plain, with their endless patience and their endless mud, built their own mountains, brick by brick by brick, and set the houses of their gods on the summits. Every great Mesopotamian city had its ziggurat. The Sumerians had built them for 2,000 years before Babylon was raised. But Babylon's was the greatest of them all, or meant to be. Etmani, restored and raised to its full height by Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, climbed in 7 great stages, each smaller than the one below, to a height that may have approached 90 meters. A man-made mountain of blue glazed and plain brick, with 3 great stairways climbing its face, to the first terrace, and a temple of the god, crowning the summit, where Herodotus reported no image stood only a great bed and a golden table, and where the priests told him the god himself came. To sleep from its summit, a watcher could see the whole city spread below the blue gate, the river, the canals, the palaces, the endless flat brown plain running to the edge of the world, and could realize, standing there, in the wind between earth and sky, exactly what the builders intended, that here, and nowhere else, heaven and earth were joined, that this was the foundation house of both, that Babylon was the hinge of the cosmos, the place where the divine touched the human, the gate of the god made stone. And here we must gently lay the legend beside the truth, because this tower, Etani, the ziggurat of Babylon, is almost certainly the original, the seed of one of the most famous stories ever told, the Tower of Babel. The Hebrew scribes who wrote the book of Genesis knew Babylon. Some of them, as we will see, lived there in exile in its shadow, and saw its great tower climbing toward the sky. And they told a story about it, about a proud people who came to the plain of Shinar, which is to say Suma, and said to one another, "Come, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name." And God, seeing the tower, and the pride of it, and the one language that let them attempt so overweening a thing, came down and confounded their speech, so that they could no longer understand one another, and scattered them across the face of the earth, and left the tower unfinished. And the place was called Babel, the story says, with a pun the Babylonians would not have recognized, because there the Lord did confound the language of all the earth. Babylon, the gate of the god, the Babylonians' own proud name for their own holy place, turned by the wit of an exiled people who had no love for the city that held them captive into Babel, confusion, the monument to human arrogance, struck down by heaven. It is one of the most extraordinary acts of reinterpretation in all of literature. A conquered people taking the proudest building of their conquerors and rewriting it forever as a warning, so that for thousands of years, long after the real tower had crumbled into a brick-robed pit, Babel would mean not the gate of the god, but the folly of reaching too high. the noise of too many tongues, the dream that overreaches and is scattered. The real Letomani was a triumph of engineering and devotion, raised by a patient people to honor their God. The Tower of Babel is what their enemies made of it in memory. Both towers are real in their way. Only one of them was made of brick. And now we come to the most famous wonder of all, and also the most uncertain, the one that floats half-real between history and dream, the way the best legends do, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the canonical list the Greeks drew up of the things most worth crossing the world to see. The pyramids, and the lighthouse, and the great statues, and among them the Hanging Gardens of Douta, Babylon, the green terraces rising in the desert air. The Greek and Roman writers described them with wonder, a series of planted terraces rising one above another like the seats of a theatre or the steps of a duke. Mountainside, built up on great vated stone foundations and covered with deep soil in which grew not just flowers and shrubs, but full-size trees, so that from a distance the whole structure looked like a green wooded hill floating impossibly above the brown city. A forest in the air, in a land that had no forests, in the driest place on earth. And the marvel within the marvel was the water. For to keep that hanging forest green under the murderous Mesopotamian sun, water had to be lifted constantly from the river far below to the highest terraces by some mechanism that ancient writers describe with fascination but imperfect understanding. Screws or chains of buckets or hidden engines raising the Euphrates up into the sky to fall again, through the soil, and keep the impossible garden alive. The story the Greeks told was a love story too, as the best stories are, that a Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, in the usual telling, built the gardens for his queen, a woman from the green mountains of Media in the north, who pined amid the flat brown monotony of the plain for the wooded heights of her home, and that the king, to comfort her, built her a mountain, a green wooded water-fed mountain, in the middle of his city, so that she might climb its terraces and feel for a moment that she had come home. Whether any of it is true in that form, no one knows, for here is the strange thing, the thing that makes the Hanging Gardens the most haunting of all the wonders. We are not sure they existed, not at Babylon at least. Of all the marvels of the city, the gardens are the one that the Babylonians themselves never mention. Nebuchadnezzar, who inscribed his name on millions of bricks and boasted in inscription after inscription of every wall and gate and temple he raised, who could not build a drainage canal without recording it for eternity, says not one single word about a wondrous hanging garden, the very thing that would later become his most famous monument. The archaeologists who dug Babylon for decades found the gate and the walls and the ziggurats, foundations and the palace, but never found with any certainty the gardens. And the Greek writers who described them so vividly were all writing centuries later, repeating older accounts. None of them clear eyewitnesses. So where are they? Some scholars conclude soberly that they never existed at all, that they are a literary invention, a traveler's tale that grew in the telling, a green dream, draped over the real city by people who had heard that Babylon was wonderful and supplied it in the imagination with the most wonderful thing they could conceive. Others have proposed a fascinating solution, that the famous gardens were real, but were not in Babylon at all, that they were built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, the very destroyer of Babylon, at his great capital of Nineveh in the north, where an inscription does boast of a wonder for all peoples, a palace garden watered by an ingenious mechanism fed by an aqueduct, whose remains have been traced across the hills, and that later writers, knowing only that there had been a fabulous garden somewhere in fabulous Mesopotamia, and that Babylon was the famous city, simply attached the Assyrian wonder to the Babylonian name, as legend so often, and attaches the deed to the more famous doer. It is a beautiful irony, if it is true, that the most famous glory of Babylon may in fact have belonged to the city that destroyed Babylon, transplanted across the centuries by the carelessness of memory, so that Nineveh, erased and forgotten, lives on unknowingly as the green crown of its own victim. We do not know, and there is something exactly right about not knowing, about this one wonder remaining a wonder in the oldest sense, a thing marveled at but never quite grasped, hovering forever just out of reach, green and impossible above the city of the legend. The walls we can measure, the gate we have rebuilt, the tower we can trace in its foundations, that the gardens stay where the best dreams stay, just above the solid world, watered by a river we cannot quite see, growing trees in the empty air. Let them hang there in the dark as you drift. A green hill floating over a brown plain under the stars, kept alive by hidden water. Real or not, it hardly matters now, for whether Nebuchadnezzar built them or the Greeks dreamed them, they have been growing in the human imagination for 2,500 years, and they have never needed soil to do it. Step down now from the wonders, from the gate and the tower and the floating garden, into the streets, into the ordinary, teeming, noisy, fragrant life of the greatest city on earth. Because Babylon was not only a stage set of marvels, it was a place where, at its height, perhaps 200,000 human beings lived their whole lives, very likely the first city in the history of the world to hold so many, the largest concentration of humanity that had ever existed up to that time. To stand in its streets was to stand at the absolute center of the human world, in the densest gathering of people the planet had yet produced. And what a gathering it was! Babylon at its height was a city of staggering variety, the cosmopolitan heart of a far-flung empire, and into it flowed peoples and goods and tongues from across the known world. There were native Babylonians, of course, the old urban families, proud of their ancient pedigrees. There were Chaldeans, the southern tribal people of the ruling dynasty. There were Arameans, whose language, Aramaic, simpler to write than cuneiform, scratched in ink on skin, and sure, rather than pressed in wedges on clay, was quietly becoming the common tongue of the whole Near East, the language of the street and the market, even as the priests and scholars kept up the ancient written Babylonian. There were Mez and Persians and Elamites from the eastern mountains, Phoenician and Syrian and Anatolian merchants from the west, Egyptians, Arabs from the southern deserts with their incense and their camels. And there were the deported peoples, the populations that Babylon, like Assyria before it, uprooted from conquered lands and resettled in and around the capital. Among them, as we will see, the people of Judah, weeping by the rivers. 70 languages, the legend would later say, was spoken in the streets of Babylon. The very multiplicity that the Tower of Babel story would turn into a curse, but which in life was simply the sound of a world city. A Babel, yes, but the Babel of trade and gossip and love and argument in a dozen tongues at once, under the blue gate. The streets near the center were laid out in part on a grid, straight and planned, a sign of deliberate design, rare in the ancient world, where most cities grew like brambles. The houses were of mud brick, blank-walled and windowless on the street side for privacy. Coolness that opening inward onto courtyards where the life of the household happened, cooking, spinning children, the family shrine with its little clay figures of protective gods buried beneath the threshold, to guard the door. The markets along the canals and the river caves roared with commerce. Dates by the tongue, the staple sweetness of the plain, and barley and sesame and wool, fish from the rivers, imported timber and stone, and metal and lapis and ivory, wine from the north, and beer everywhere. Thick Babylonian beer, drunk through reed straws from communal jars, boats crowded the quays and the canals that threaded the city. For Babylon was a city of waterways as much as streets, the Euphrates running through its heart, canals branching off to carry water and goods to every quarter. There were temples beyond counting, over 1,000 shrines, the texts claim, great and small. For Babylon was above all a holy city thick with gods. There were schools where boys and a few girls learned the brutal discipline of the cuneiform, script, copying out lists and proverbs, and the ancient classics on their clay tablets, under stern masters who beat them for blots, leaving us in their exercise tablets, the homework of children dead 3,000 years. There were astronomers on the temple rooftops, and merchants tallying accounts, and bakers, and brewers, and weavers, and potters, and barbers, and prostitutes, and priests, and beggars, and kings. 200,000 human lives packed together behind the impregnable walls beneath the floating air gardens, at the foot of the tower that touched heaven, in the city, at the center of the world. Let the sound of it carry you now, the 70 tongues, the boats on the canals, the beasts in the markets, the children chanting their lists, the endless human murmur of the largest gathering of people the earth had ever held, rising into the warm night over the blue gate, going on and on, as it did every night, for the better part of 100 years of glory. Let us linger a little longer in the warm, ordinary life of the city, before we climb back up to the gods and the stars. For we have spoken of markets and households, but not yet of the table and the song, and no portrait of a people is complete without the things they ate and drank, and the music they made. Since these, more than monuments, are where a civilization keeps its joy. Babylon ate, above all, 2 things, barley and dates. The barley was the staff of life, ground into flour for flatbreads, baked on the walls of clay ovens or in the ashes, cooked into porrides and growls, and most beloved of all, brewed into beer. For beer was not in Babylon an indulgence. It was a staple food, a daily bread in liquid form, drunk by everyone, men and women, rich and poor. Workers paid in rations of it, gods offered it, the sick dossed with it. Babylonian beer was thick and nourishing, more like a fermented porridge than the clear drink we know, often drunk through long reed straws, dipped into a communal jar to filter out the floating husks and sediment. A circle of people perhaps gathered around a great jar, each with a reed sharing the brew, an image of conviviality 4,000 years old. There were many kinds, dark and pale and sweetened and spiced, and the brewing of it was largely women's work, and the selling of it the business of the tavern keepers, those women whom Hammurabi's laws watched so closely, regulating their honesty and their prices, and forbidding them to harbor plotters. The tavern was the social heart of the ordinary quarter, the place of drink and gossip and music, and the moralists complained worse, and the gods themselves had their drinking. For the beautiful body hymns to the beer goddess Ningi double as brewing recipes, praising the goddess who fills the vat and tends the mash, so that to sing her praises was quite literally to recite how beer was made. The dates were the sweetness of the plain, the fruit of the date palm, which grew everywhere along the canals and rivers, prodigiously productive, the tree that fed the south. Dates were eaten fresh and dried, pressed into syrup that served as the great sweetener in a world with no sugar, fermented into date wine, and the palm itself gave timber and fronds and fiber, every part of it used. Beyond barley and dates, there were onions and garlic and leeks, chickpeas and lentils and beans, cucumbers and gourds, the herbs and spices the cooks prized. There was fish from the rivers and canals, abundant and cheap, eaten fresh and dried and salted. There was mutton and goat, and for the rich, beef and game. There was milk and cheese and butter from the herds. There was sesame grown for its oil, the cooking fat and lamp fuel of the plain. There were apples and figs and pomegranates and grapes, and remarkably we know how they cooked it. For among the tablets are the oldest recipes in the world, a handful of clay tablets recording elaborate Babylonian dishes, mostly rich meat stews, and broths, flavored with onion and garlic and leek, and herbs and fat and sour milk. Instructions for the kitchens of temples or palaces, or the wealthy tur and professional assuming a cook who already knows the art, the oldest written cookery on earth. The proof that here, as everywhere, eating well was a craft and a pleasure and worth writing down. And over the feast, and in the temple, and in the tavern, and in the street there was music. For Mesopotamia was a deeply musical civilization, and we know more of its music than of almost any other ancient lands, because once again they wrote it down. They had a rich array of instruments, harps and lyres of great beauty, some of which survive. The famous lyres recovered from the royal graves of inlaid with gold and lapis, and shell crowned, with the golden head of a bull, among the most exquisite objects the ancient world has left us, and lutes and reed pipes and flutes and drums of every size, and rattles and sirens and cymbals. a whole orchestra of sound. There were professional musicians and singers attached to temples and palaces, a respected and skilled profession. There was music for worship, hymns sung to the gods in their temples, music for the king's feast, music for mourning, the laments sung over the dead and over fallen cities, a great Mesopotamian genre. The city lament weeping in formal beauty, over or Nippur or Babylon brought low, music for love and for drinking, and for work, and for putting children to sleep. And astonishingly, this is one of the small miracles of the record. They wrote down not just the words, but something of the music itself. Tablets survive that record musical theory, the tuning of the strings, the names of intervals and scales, and even on one famous broken tablet from the Syrian coast in the uniform tradition, what many scholars believe is the oldest written melody in the world, a hymn with both its words and notation preserved. A song from more than 3,000 years ago that musicians today have tried tentatively, haltingly to play again. The actual sound of the ancient Near East, or our best guess at it, lifted out of the clay after 3 millennia of silence. Think of that as you drift, that we can almost hear them, not just read their laws and their letters, but very nearly hear the tune they sang. The oldest melody humanity wrote down drifting up out of the mud, faint and strange and lovely. The sound of a people who ate their bread and drank their thick beer through reeds and loved their children and sang to their gods and to each other by the slow river under the stars 4,000 years ago, and wrote even their music on the clay so that some far-off sleepless age might hear across all that dark the faint sweet ghost of their song. We have walked the streets of Babylon and stood in its markets. Let us now go in through one of those blank street walls, into a courtyard, into a house, and spend an hour with the ordinary life of a Babylonian family, and especially with the women of Babylon, whose lives the clay tablets illuminate more fully than those of almost any other women of the ancient world, and in ways that often surprise those who expect the deep past to be uniformly cruel to them. The Babylonian house turned its back on the street, blank wall outside for coolness and privacy, and opened inward onto a central courtyard around which the rooms were arranged. The courtyard, the heart of the home, open to the sky, where much of life happened, where the cooking fire burned, and the children played, and the family gathered in the cool of the evening. Beneath the floor, often the family dead were buried, so that the ancestors remained quite literally part of the household, fed and remembered with offerings. Their ghosts are presents to be honored, lest they turn restless. A small shrine held the figures of the household gods, the protective spirits of the home. The family that lived there was the basic unit of Babylonian society, and it was by law and custom patriarchal, headed by the husband and father, who held authority over wife and children, who could in hard times even sell family members into debt slavery to pay what he owed. The harshness was real, and we should not soften it. This was a hierarchical, often brutal world, in which the law valued people by rank and sex, in which slavery was woven through everything, in which a woman's life was bounded in ways ours is not. And yet, and this is what surprises, within those bounds, the Babylonian woman possessed rights and protections and scope that many later societies would deny her. She could own property in her own name, and many did. Fields, houses, slaves, silver. She brought a dowry to her marriage that remained in an important sense hers, protecting her and her children, and that she could pass to her children rather than have it absorbed by her husband. She could run a business. We meet women who were merchants, brewers, tavern keepers, weavers, even moneylenders, transacting in their own right. She could go to court, sue, and be sued, testify, sign contracts with her own seal. A wife mistreated or neglected could, under Hammurabi's laws, seek divorce and depart with her dowry. A husband who divorced a wife who had borne him children owed her support and the return of her scores. Dowry. A widow could not simply be cast out, but had rights in her husband's estate and the guardianship of her children. There were priestesses of high status and great economic power. The Nadu women dedicated to a god who did not marry or bore no children, and who often became shrewd and wealthy businesswomen managing estates and lending silver, a recognized and respected class of independent women living in their own quarter. Marriage itself was a contract negotiated between families with terms written down and witnessed. And while it was unequal, it was not without mutual obligation. And the documents show us here and there beneath the legal language the ordinary texture of married life, affection and quarrel, the longing for children, the grief at their loss, the management of a household, the partnership, however unequal, of two people making a life, and the children. The children of Babylon are everywhere in the record, loved and worried over exactly as children always are. We have their toys dug from the ground, little clay rattles, model animals, miniature furniture, game boards, and dice and knucklebones. We have lullabies, among the oldest in the world, sung to quiet a crying baby in the night. One surviving Babylonian lullaby gently and a little alarmingly warns the wakeful infant that its crying is disturbing the house god and must stop a tired parent's small theology of bedtime, 4,000 years old. We have prayers for children to be born and prayers for sick children to be healed, and the small, heartbreaking graves of children who were not buried beneath the family floor with a few beads or a little pot by parents whose grief reaches us undimmed across the millennia. We have the schoolboy with his caning and his anxious father. We have, in short, the whole of family life, the marriages and the dowies, and the quarrels and the divorces, the businesses run by capable women, the babies sung to sleep, the children buried and mourned, the ancestors fed beneath the floor, the ordinary, eternal, unremarkable human business of living together in a house which went on behind the blank street walls of Babylon, under the same stars the astronomers watched for 2,000 years. It is this, more than any wonder, that the clay gives back, and that is worth carrying into sleep. Not the gate and the tower, but the courtyard and the lullaby. Not the king on his rooftop, but the mother, in the dark, singing her baby quiet. The father slipping silver to the teacher, the widow holding on to her dowie. The family gathered in the cool of the evening around the fire with the dead beneath the floor, and the gods in their niche, and the children asleep. At last, they were us. The walls fell, and the gods are gone, and the language went silent. But the household at evening, the baby in the night, the love and the worry and the grief, those did not fall. Those are not gone. Those are in every house tonight. The unbroken thing, the human thing, carried 4,000 years from that courtyard to this one, and not changed at all. To understand Babylon, you must understand that it was before all else a holy city, and that its holiness was bound up entirely with one God, who had risen over the centuries exactly as the city itself had risen from nothing to the mastery of all. That God was Marduk. In the beginning, in the old Sumerian and early Babylonian days, Marduk was a minor deity, the local god of the unimportant town of Babylon, ranked far below the great ancient gods of the plain, Arnu the sky-father, Enlil, the lord of the air and of kingship, Enki, or Ea, the god of wisdom and the sweet waters. But as Babylon rose, Marduk rose with it, for in the theology of the plain, the rank of a god and the rank of his city moved together. And by the height of Babylon's power, Marduk had been elevated in the great religious epic the Babylonians composed and recited to the kingship of all the gods. That epic, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian story of creation, named from its first words, went on high, told how in the beginning there was only the mingling of fresh water and salt water, Apsu, and the great mother Tiamat, the primordial sea, a dragon of chaos, and how the younger gods, troubled and threatened by her, could find no champion to face her, until Marduk stepped forward and bargained. "Make me king of all the gods, supreme and forever, and I will fight her." And they agreed. And Marduk armed himself with the winds, and the storm, and the lightning, and went out against Tiamat, the chaos dragon, and caught her in his net, and drove the winds into her open jaws, so she could not close them, and loosed his arrow into her belly, and split her in two like a shellfish. And from one half of her body he made the dome of the sky, and from the other half, the earth, and set the stars in their courses, and ordained the moon, and decreed the calendar. And from the blood of her defeated captain consort, he fashioned mixed with clay, the first human, beings whose purpose was to do the labor of the gods, so that the gods might rest, and the gods, in gratitude, built Marduk, a house, Babylon with its great tower Etani, and proclaimed his 50 names, and made him king of heaven, and king earth forever. It is one of the oldest creation stories humanity possesses, older in its roots than the book of Genesis, with which it shares so many deep echoes. The watery chaos before creation, the dividing of the waters, the making of humankind from clay, the rest at the end. And it was not merely a story to the Babylonians, it was the charter of their city, the cosmic justification for Babylon's supremacy. Babylon ruled the world because Marduk ruled the gods, and Marduk ruled the gods because in the beginning he alone had dared to face the dragon. And once a year, this whole cosmic drama was made flesh in the streets. In the greatest festival of the Babylonian year, the Akitu, the New Year festival, held over 11 days in the spring at the turning of the year, it was the heartbeat of the sacred city. Through those days, the statues of the gods were gathered from their temples. The Enuma Elish, the creation epic, was solemnly recited, reenacting Marduk's victory over chaos and his renewal of the order of the world. And at the festival's climax came 2 extraordinary rituals. In the first, the king himself, the most powerful man in the world, was brought into the Holy of Holies before the statue of Marduk, and there the high priest stripped him of his royal insignia, his crown and scepter and ring, and struck him across the face and pulled his ears, and forced him to kneel and make a negative confession before the god. I have not sinned, O Lord of the lands. I have not been negligent of your divinity. I have not destroyed Babylon. I have not neglected its people. Only if the king wept, if the tears came, a sign the god accepted his submission, where the insignia returned, and his kingship renewed for another year. Imagine it. The master of an empire once a year slapped and humbled and made to weep before his god, his very crown made conditional on his tears. It is one of the most remarkable rituals in the history of kingship, a yearly reminder built into the heart of the most absolute monarchy on earth, that the king, too, was a servant, that his power was lent and not owned, that even he knelt before something higher. And then the king restored, came the second great act, the procession, in which the statue of Marduk and the gods of all the cities gathered as his guests were carried in triumph out through the blue Ishtar Gate, along the processional way, past the glazed lions, in a blaze of music and Gortkang incense, and rejoicing out to a special temple beyond the walls and back the god walking his city. The order of the cosmos renewed for another year. The chaos dragon defeated once more. Babylon confirmed again as the navel of the world. For as long as the Akitu was kept, Babylon was eternal. We will see near the very end what it meant when at last a king failed to keep it, when the god did not walk, and the year turned without its renewal, and the dragon, in a sense, was let back in. Climb now in your mind to the rooftops, to the flat roofs of the temples, where on clear nights, which on that dry plain meant almost every night, men stood and looked up and wrote down what they saw. And in doing so, slowly, over centuries, almost by accident, invented one of the foundations of all later science. The Babylonians watched the sky because they believed utterly that it was a text, that the gods wrote their intentions in the movements of the heavens, and that a sufficiently learned and patient person could read them. The moon, the sun, the 5 wandering stars we call planets, the fixed stars, the eclipses, the halos, the risings and settings, all of it was a message, an omen, a warning, or a promise about the fate of the king and the kingdom. And so to read the divine will, the priests and scholars of Babylon began, many centuries before the city's golden age, and continuing for centuries after, to keep records of the sky, careful, dated, systematic observations night after night, year after year, generation after generation, written on clay and stored in the temple archives. They noted where the moon rose and set, when the planets appeared and vanished and turned back in their courses, when eclipses came, and how they moved. And they kept these records not for a year or a decade, but for centuries, an unbroken chain of observation longer than any other in the ancient world. Perhaps the longest sustained scientific project in human history before modern times. And here is the wonder, the thing that lifts Babylon from a city of priests to a cradle of science, that when you watch the sky that carefully for that long and write it all down, the omens begin to turn into something else. Patterns emerge from the records. The watchers began to notice that the heavens were not random, that the eclipses came in cycles, that the planets returned to the same places after fixed intervals, that the whole vast dance of the sky was in fact regular, predictable, governed by number. And so the Babylonian astronomers, still seeking omens, still believing the gods wrote in the stars, became over generations able to predict the very movements they were recording, to calculate in advance when an eclipse would fall, where a planet would stand, how the moon would move, using mathematics of astonishing sophistication, tables, and sequences, and arithmetic methods that anticipated by many centuries the achievements of the Greeks who would later learn from them. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, and the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds, the 60-based counting of the old Sumerians handed down, and we use their divisions still every time we read a clock or measure an angle, the degrees of your horoscope and the minutes of your hour, a Babylonian, pressed into clay on a temple roof 3,000 years ago, and never since let go. They mapped the band of sky through which the sun and moon and planets move, and divided it into the 12 signs. The zodiac that astrology and astronomy alike still use. The ram and the bull and the twins and the scorpion that people read in newspapers today first swam up out of the Babylonian night. They sought the will of the gods, and they found instead the laws of the sky, and they handed those laws along with the omens to the Greeks, and the Greeks handed them to the world. And the whole long road that runs from a priest on a Babylonian rooftop to a telescope in orbit begins here on the flat roofs of the temples, with men who only wanted to know what the gods intended, watching and writing it down and watching again for 1,000 patient years. There is something almost unbearably moving in it, if you let yourself feel it in the dark, that the science by which we now know the stars to be vast burning suns, indifferent to us, careless of kings, was born from the absolute conviction that those same stars were a message written personally to us by the gods. The Babylonians were wrong about why the sky mattered, and in being wrong with such patience and such care for so many centuries, they discovered how the sky actually worked, and gave us the hours and the degrees and the zodiac, and the very idea that the heavens obey laws we can find. They were looking for the gods. They found the universe, and they could not tell, and we perhaps cannot entirely tell either, of the two is the greater thing to have found. We have stood on the rooftops with the astronomers and watched them turn the will of the gods into the laws of the sky. But beneath that achievement, making it possible, lay another that is in its own way even more astonishing, and that the world has only fully appreciated in the last century, the mathematics of Babylon, which was by a long way the most sophisticated the world would see until the Greeks, and in some respects until far later than that. It begins with the strangest and most consequential choice, the base. We count in tens almost certainly because we have 10 fingers, and our whole number system is built on powers of 10. The Babylonians, inheriting the system of the Sumerians, counted in 60s. Their number system was sexamal base 60, a great wheel of 60 rather than 10, and though it sounds impossibly awkward, it was in truth a stroke of deep practical genius. For 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Far more factors than 10 possesses, which makes the dividing and proportioning that fills all practical arithmetic enormously easier. A third, or a quarter, or a sixth of 60 is a whole number, where a third of 10 is a mess, and it gave them something else, something they grasped, and that the world would then lose for thousands of years, and have to reinvent a true place value system. Just as in our system, the digit 3 means 3, or 30, or 300, depending on its place. So in the Babylonian system, the same wedge symbol meant a different multiple of 60, depending on its position, units, then 60s, then 60s mass, 60s, and so on, which let them write and manipulate very large and very small numbers with an ease no other ancient system could match. They were missing only one thing for a long time, a true zero as a placeholder, which led to ambiguities they resolved by context before eventually developing a placeholder symbol. But the core idea, place value, the single most powerful idea in the writing of numbers was theirs 3,000 years, and more, before it would be perfected in India and carried to the medieval West as the system we use today. And with this system, they did extraordinary things. They built vast tables, multiplication tables, tables of reciprocals for division, tables of squares and cubes, and square roots and cube roots. The computational machinery of a sophisticated mathematical culture used by scribes and surveyors and builders and astronomers. They could solve problems that we would now write as quadratic equations, and some that reached toward the cubic, working them through in words and numbers with confident method. They calculated areas and volumes, the fields to be taxed, the earth to be moved for a canal, the bricks needed for a wall, the practical geometry of a state that lived by measuring land and water and labor. They knew and used the relationship between the sides of a right triangle that we call the Pythagorean theorem, that the square on the longest side equals the sum of the squares on the other two. More than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, one famous tablet lists what appear to be Pythagorean triples, whole number sets of sides for right triangles, in a sequence so sophisticated that scholars still argue over exactly what mathematical purpose its maker had in mind. Another tablet shows a square with its diagonals and a strikingly accurate value for the square root of 2, a number that cannot be written exactly approximated by the Babylonians to a precision of about 1 part in 2 million. A feat of pure computation with no obvious practical purpose, mathematics done it seems for the sheer correctness of it. They approached the area of a circle and worked with the ratio we call pi with rough but serviceable values. They handled fractions with a fluency their place value system gave them, and that later, clumsier systems would struggle to match. What is the meaning of all this at the edge of sleep? Only this, perhaps, that the people we are so tempted to picture as remote and primitive, praying to demons and watching for omens in the liver of a sheep, were at the very same time, with the very same minds, doing mathematics of a power and elegance that would not be surpassed for millennia, that the same scribe might in 1 hour recite an incantation against the ghost that brings headache, and in the next calculate the square root of 2 to 6 sexesimal places, for no reason but the pleasure of the truth. We are not, it turns out, so far above them, nor they so far below us. The mind that watched the stars and found the laws beneath the omens. The mind that counted in 60s and gave us our hours and our degrees. The mind that knew the theorem of the right triangle 1,000 years before the Greek whose name it bears. That was the Babylonian mind, and it is recognizably wonderfully our own. Curious, patient, delighting in pattern, reaching for the order beneath the surface of things, doing mathematics on a clay tablet by lamplight on a hot night 4,000 years ago. For the same reason anyone has ever done it, because the world has a hidden order, and it is a deep human joy to find it. Let that be one of the last things you carry down, that they thought as we think and found what we find, and that the long chain of minds reaching for the order of the world, link by link across 4,000 years, runs unbroken, from a scribe pressing wedges into clay on the plain between the rivers, all the way to you, lying in the dark, still curious, at the far end of the same long thought, beneath the temples and the palaces and the marching dragons. The thing that actually made Babylon run, the quiet engine under all the glory, was trade and accounting, and the slow, world-changing invention of the tools of commerce. For Babylon was, above almost everything else, a city of merchants and ledgers, and in the patient business of buying and selling, and lending and recording, the people of the plain worked out some of the foundational machinery of all economic life ever since. Remember the bargain the land forced on them. The plain had grain and dates and wool in abundance, and almost nothing else. No metal, no stone, no timber, no precious things. Everything else had to be brought in, traded for, carried across deserts and up rivers and over mountains, copper and tin to make bronze, gold and silver, lapis lazuli from the far mountains of the east, cedar from the western highlands, ivory and exotic goods from distant lands. And so the surplus grain and wool and dates of the irrigated plain became the engine of a vast, long-distance trade flowing out along the rivers and the caravan roads, and drawing the wealth of half a world back into the cities. Babylon sat astride this commerce, like a great heart pumping goods and silver through the arteries of the ancient Near East. And to manage that commerce, the Babylonians and their Sumerian predecessors did something epoch. They worked out, piece by piece, the abstract machinery of economic exchange. They used silver, measured by weight, as a standard of value against which everything else could be priced. Not coins, not yet, but weighed lumps and rings of silver, a true money of account, that let you compare the value of a measure of barley to a jar of oil, to a day's labor, to a slave, to a house. All reckoned in a common standard. They wrote contracts. Thousands upon thousands of them survive, for every conceivable transaction: sales, loans, leases, partnerships, marriages, adoptions, the hiring of labor, the renting of fields, the lending of silver at interest. They charged interest and argued about it, and the law regulated it. They developed the loan and the promissory note and the deposit, and something very like banking, with great family firms and temple institutions, lending silver and grain across generations, keeping accounts, financing trade ventures, foreclosing on the unlucky. They invented, in effect, much of the basic apparatus of finance, and they wrote it all down, in cuneiform form on clay, so that we possess today an economic record of astonishing richness. We can trace the price of barley in Babylon across centuries, watch it spike in years of war and famine, and fall in years of plenty. Follow individual merchants and their ventures and their debts. Read the complaint of a furious customer to a copper dealer named A&R, whose goods were shoddy and whose service was insulting. A 4,000-year-old letter of complaint, so perfectly, recognizably human in its aggrieved fury, that it has become, in our own age, a small internet legend, the oldest known customer complaint, the voice of every dissatisfied buyer who ever lived, pressed in clay. There is something quietly astonishing in this, to hold as you drift, that the abstractions we move our whole lives by, money, interest, contract, debt, credit, the price of things, the written promise to pay, were not always there, were not given by nature, but were invented, worked out on this hot plain, by people solving the practical problem of how to trade grain for copper across great distances and long times, and how to remember who owed what to whom. The clay tablet that records a loan of silver at interest, with its witnesses and its seal, is in its own way as great an invention as the wall, or the gate, or the tower, a piece of social technology so powerful that the whole later world runs on its descendants. Babylon gave us the hours in the zodiac from its rooftops, from its counting houses. It gave us very nearly the idea of finance itself. The merchants of the earth, the book of Revelation would say, weeping over fallen Babylon, and it was apt, for the merchants of the earth, in a sense, learned their trade here in the ledgers of the gate of the god. Now we must turn to the story that more than any other carried the name of Babylon down the centuries to us. The thread by which most people in the world still hold the city at all. Though they may never have heard of Marduk or Hammurabi or the Blue Gate, it is the story of a small people who were brought to Babylon against their will, who wept there, and who in their weeping wrote some of the most enduring words in the history of human language. Words that turned Babylon forever after into something more than a city. We left Nebuchadnezzar securing his Western Empire, the long curve of land running up the Euphrates and down the Mediterranean coast, the lands he had won from the dying Assyrians and their Egyptian allies. Among the small kingdoms of that coast was Judah, the southern remnant of the old Hebrew kingdoms, a minor hill state centered on its temple city of Jerusalem, caught, as small states always are, between the great powers, in this case between Babylon to the north and east, and Egypt to the south. And Judah fatally kept gambling on Egypt. Its kings, urged on by a party that trusted in Egyptian promises, rebelled against Babylonian overlordship, betting that Egypt would save them. Egypt never did, and Nebuchadnezzar, like every great king of the plain before him, could not tolerate a rebellious vassal astride his vital trade routes. The reckoning came in stages, and they were terrible. First, around the year 597, before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar marched on rebellious Jerusalem, took the city, and carried off its young king, its nobles, its craftsmen, its soldiers, and the treasures of its temple, deporting the leading families to Babylon. The policy of the plain, the breaking of a people by removing its head, by carrying its elite into exile among strangers where they could make no more trouble. He left a puppet king behind, and the puppet in turn rebelled, again trusting in Egypt, again betrayed by the gamble. And so around the year 586 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar came again, and this time there was no mercy. The Babylonian army besieged Jerusalem for a year and a half, until the famine inside the walls was beyond endurance. And then they breached the walls and took the city. And this time they destroyed it, burned the palaces and the great houses, threw down the walls, and above all, destroyed the temple, the house of the Hebrew God, the center of the whole religious world of Judah, built by Solomon 4 centuries before, plundered now of its sacred vessels, and burned to the ground. The last king of Judah was forced to watch his sons killed before his eyes, and then was blinded so that the death of his sons would be the last thing he ever saw, and was carried in chains to Babylon. And the people of Judah, not all but the heart of the nation, the families that mattered by the thousands, were marched, the long road into Mesopotamia, into exile, to live by the canals of Babylon, in the shadow of the city of Marduk, the Babylonian captivity, the exile. It should have been the end of the way. It had been the end of so many peoples before, the way it had been the end of the 10 tribes of Israel, deported by Assyria a century and a half earlier, and dissolved forever into the nations, the lost tribes gone. Deportation was designed to do exactly that, to break a people's connection to its land and its temple and its God, to scatter and absorb and erase it. And by every precedent, Judah should have vanished into Babylon, as Israel had vanished into Assyria. One more uprooted people, fading into the great human babel of the empire, remembered by no one. But it did not happen. And why it did not happen is one of the genuine turning points in the history of the world. One of those moments where the whole long story of the human race bends in a new direction, in the dark, almost unnoticed, among a defeated people weeping beside a foreign canal. For the exiles of Judah, stripped of their land, stripped of their king, stripped above all of their temple, the one place their God could be worshipped. Now a heap of ash 1,000 miles away did not dissolve. Instead, in their loss, they turned inward and downward to the one thing the Babylonians could not take and could not burn. Their words cut off from the temple and its sacrifices. They became a people of the book rather than a people of the place, gathering, remembering, writing down, and editing, and shaping the traditions and laws and stories and songs that would become the Hebrew Bible, the scripture that would father 3 of the world's great religions. Much of the Hebrew scripture, as we have it, was given its decisive shape in and after the Babylonian exile, by people determined that their identity would survive, even the loss of everything that had once seemed to define it. They reimagined their faith so that it could live anywhere in any land without a temple carried, in the mind and the scroll and the practice of a scattered people. And in doing so, they invented something genuinely new in the religious history of humankind, a portable homeland, a faith that could not be destroyed by destroying a building. Because its true temple was now made of words, the Babylonians, by trying to erase Judah, accidentally forged the very thing that made Judah indestructible. And by those rivers, in that exile, an unknown poet of Judah wrote a song of such grief and such enduring power that it is still sung in 100 languages, 26 centuries later, by the rivers of Judah, Babylon. It begins, "There we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there, they that carried us away captive, required of us a song, and they that wasted us, required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion, and then the heart of it." The question that has echoed down all the centuries since, the cry of every exile who ever lived. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? It is perhaps the most beautiful thing ever written about exile, about loss, about the impossible task of keeping your soul intact in a place that is not your home. And it was written in grief, in captivity, in the shadow of the Blue Gate, about this city by one of the people Babylon had broken. And it did more to make Babylon immortal than all the works of all her kings. Nebuchadnezzar built walls to be remembered by, and gates of glazed blue, and a tower toward heaven, and he is remembered by most of the world as the villain of a song written by one of his weeping captives who had nothing left but words, and who needed nothing more. The same exiled people who wrote the song by the rivers also wrote stories about Babylon and its kings, stories gathered much later in the biblical book of Daniel. And these stories, though they are theology and legend rather than chronicle, became so famous that they shaped the image of Babylon for the entire Western world for the next 2,000 years. Two of them in particular have entered the common speech of humankind, and we should tell them in the dark, because whatever their relation to literal history, they are part of the true story of how Babylon became the Babylon of legend. The first is the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. The book of Daniel tells how the great king at the very height of his power and pride walked upon the roof of his palace and looked out over the wonder he had made and said in his heart the most dangerous sentence a powerful man can say, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for thee, house of the kingdom, by the might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty?" And in that moment of supreme self-regard, the story says, a voice came from heaven, and the king's reason was taken from him. And Nebuchadnezzar, the master of the world, was driven out from among men, and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, and his hair grew like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws, a beast in the field, where a king had been until 7 seasons had passed. And he learned in his madness the lesson the heavens meant to teach him, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomsoever he will, and that even the greatest king is grass. And then the story says his reason returned, and he lifted up his eyes to heaven, and blessed the power above his own, and was restored. It is a parable, of course, a meditation on pride and its fall, on the smallness of even the mightiest human power before something greater. And there is no Babylonian record of any such madness in the great king, but it captured something, and it has never let go. The image of the proudest builder in history, brought low, eating grass in the shadow of his own walls. A warning carved into the legend of Babylon about what happens to those who say, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built?" The very greatness of the city became in the hands of its captives, the setting for the oldest lesson of all. And the second story is even more famous, and it brings us to the very edge of Babylon's fall. It is the story of Belshazzar's feast, and it is set on the last night of Babylon. The book of Daniel tells how a king, it calls Belshazzar, a prince of the last Babylonian dynasty, held a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and in his drunken pride called for the sacred golden vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had carried off from the temple in Jerusalem, and drank wine from them, he and his lords and his wives, and praised the gods of gold and silver, and bronze and stone. And in that same hour, the story says, the fingers of a hand appeared, and wrote upon the plaster of the palace wall, in the light of the lamps, words that no one could read. And the king's face changed, and his knees knocked together in terror, and none of his wise men could read the writing until they called for the exile Daniel, who read it. Many, many tech are passing, numbered, weighed, divided. God has numbered the days of your kingdom, and brought it to an end. Daniel told the trembling king, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And that very night, the story ends in the flat last words that have chilled readers for 2,500 years. That very night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom. The writing on the wall, the phrase has outlived the empire by 26 centuries. We still say it of any doom that is plain to see and willfully ignored. And it points us now toward the true and stranger history of how the impregnable city, the gate of the god, the center of the world, came at last to fall. Not in the way the legend tells, perhaps, but fall it did, and the writing, in a sense, was on the wall. The true story of Babylon's fall is, as the true stories so often are, stranger and sadder and more human than the legend. And at its center stands one of the most peculiar and fascinating figures in all of ancient history, the last king of Babylon, a man named Nabonidus, who lost the greatest city in the world, in part because of a quarrel with its god. Nebuchadnezzar died around the year 562 before the Common Era, full of years and glory, and with him the strong hand that had held the empire passed away, and the now familiar pattern began again, the tide going out. His successes were weak or short-lived. There were palace intrigues and quick reigns, and at least one murder, the throne passing through unsteady hands in the space of a few years. And then, around 556, the crown came to rest on the head of Nebudis, not a member of Nebuchadnezzar's line, but an older man, a courtier of obscure origins, possibly raised to the throne by a faction, possibly a usurper, whose mother had been a devoted priestess of the moon god Sin in a distant northern city. And that detail, his devotion to the moon god Sin, turns out to be the hinge of the whole tragedy. For Nabonidus was a religious eccentric, or perhaps a religious reformer, depending on how you read him, and either way, he did the one thing the king of Babylon must never do. He neglected Marduk. He elevated the moon god Sin, the god of his mother and his northern home, to a supremacy that affronted the proud priesthood of Marduk in Babylon. And then he did something even stranger. He left for 10 years. 10 years, an almost unbelievable span. Nabonidus abandoned Babylon and went to live at a remote desert oasis far to the south, Arabia, a place called Tamar, leaving his son, the crown prince Belshazzar, yes, that Belshazzar, to govern the capital in his absence. Why he did it remains one of the great puzzles of ancient history. To control the desert trade routes, some think to escape the hostile priesthood out of religious devotion to his moon god, perhaps simply out of the strangeness of an old, willful, isolated mind. That the consequence was disastrous, and it struck at the very heart of what made Babylon Babylon, because the king, and only the king, could perform the central act of the sacred year, the Akitu, the great New Year festival, in which the king takes the hand of Marduk and leads the god in procession through the city, renewing the cosmos, confirming the order of the world. And for the 10 years that Nabonidus was absent in the desert, the festival could not be held. The god did not walk. Year after year, the spring came, and the new year turned, and Marduk stayed in his temple, and the procession did not go out through the blue gate. And the dragon of chaos was not ritually defeated, and the people of the most religious city on earth watched the sacred rhythm of their world fall. silent, abandoned by the very king whose first duty was to keep it. The Babylonian priests, our main source for all this, were apoplectic. They wrote of Nebuchadnezzar with a fury reserved for sacrilege, accusing him of impiety, of madness, of betraying the god in the city. Propaganda, surely, but propaganda growing from a real and gaping wound. The king had broken faith with Marduk, and in the theology of Babylon, when the king broke faith with the god broke faith with the king, and looked perhaps for someone new to give the kingdom to. Someone was coming from the east, from the Iranian plateau, beyond the Tigris, beyond even the Mes. A new power had risen with the speed of a storm, and at its head was a man whom even his enemies, even the peoples he conquered, would remember as something close to a model of what a conqueror could be. His name was Cyrus, king of the Persians, the founder of the largest empire the world had yet seen, and he is one of the few conquerors in all of history whom the conquered themselves remembered with gratitude. Cyrus had already, in a few astonishing years, overthrown the Mes and absorbed their kingdom, conquered fabulously wealthy Lydia in the far west of Anatolia and its golden king Croesus, built a Persian empire stretching from the Iron to the edge of India. Only one great prize remained between him and the mastery of the whole Near Eastern world: Babylon, the gate of the god, the impregnable city, the center of everything. And here the legend and the history diverge. And the history is the more remarkable of the two. The legend, the writing on the wall, the doomed feast, the city stormed in a night of judgment, imagines Babylon falling in violence and terror, the impregnable walls breached, the king slain, the streets running with blood, divine vengeance crashing down. The Greek historians added their own dramatic flourishes, telling how the cunning Persians diverted the Euphrates, lowering the river that ran through the city until their soldiers could wade in under the river gates along the drained bed, taking the revelers by surprise on a festival night. It is a wonderful story, but the oldest and most reliable sources, the Babylonian chronicles written close to the events, and Cyrus's own proclamation, tell something quieter, and in its way far more devastating to the legend of the impregnable city. They tell that Babylon very largely did not fight at all, for Cyrus had understood something that the walls could not stop. He had understood the quarrel between the king and the god. As his armies approached, having defeated the Babylonian forces in a battle out in the country, Cyrus did not present himself as a foreign conqueror come to destroy the holy city. He presented himself as the liberator of Marduk, as the rightful king whom the offended god himself had chosen to set right the impiety of Nabonidus, to restore the proper worship, to bring the god home, and the priesthood of Marduk. Alienated by their absent sacrilegious moon-worshipping king, the city itself weary of Nabonidus and his neglected festivals, they listened. When the Persian army came to Babylon, the chronicles say the city opened its gates. Cyrus entered without a battle. The impregnable walls, the moat, the towers, the defenses that no army on earth could have stormed. None of it mattered, because the city chose not to defend itself against the man who came in the name of its own god. Cyrus's own inscription, the famous clay cylinder that survives, tells it in his voice, in the careful language of a liberator, that Marduk, angry at the impiety of the land, had searched all the lands for a righteous king to take his hand, and had chosen Cyrus, and had called him by name to the rule of the whole world, and had marched at his side like a friend, and had let him enter Babylon without battle, without fighting, sparing the city any harm, and that the people of Babylon had greeted him with joy, their faces shining, blessing his name. Propaganda again, of course, the proclamation of a conqueror justifying his conquest. But the core of it is confirmed by the Babylonians' own chronicles. The great city, the center of the world, the unconquerable Babylon, fell to Cyrus the Persian in the year 539. Before the Common Era, not by storm, not by siege, not by the breaching of its mighty walls, but by opening its gates to a man who had promised to honor its God better than its own king had done. The walls Nebuchadnezzar built to be unconquerable were never even tested. The city was lost from within, in a quarrel with heaven, before the enemy ever arrived. And then the detail that makes Cyrus Cyrus, and that ties our whole night together. The new master of Babylon did a thing almost unheard of in that age of deportations and burnings. He let the captives go home. Cyrus reversed the policy of forced exile that Assyria and Babylon had practiced for centuries. He proclaimed that the peoples whom the Babylonians had uprooted and resettled could return to their homelands and restore their temples and worship their own gods. And among those peoples were the exiles of Judah, weeping by the rivers of Babylon, who now, by the decree of the Persian king, were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their ruined temple. The captivity was over. The song by the rivers had its impossible answer. And so it is that Cyrus the Persian, a conqueror, a foreign king who worshipped his own gods, is remembered in the Hebrew scriptures not as a tyrant, but as a deliverer, even astonishingly as an anointed one, a Messiah, the instrument of deliverance, the only foreign king in the whole Bible to be granted such a title. The fall of Babylon, which the legend paints as a night of doom, was for the captive people of Judah the dawn of their redemption, the gate of their long imprisonment, swinging open at last, by the hand of the man who had opened the gates of Babylon itself, without a fight. History rarely arranges its ironies so perfectly. The impregnable city fell softly in a quarrel with its god, and its fall set free the people whose weeping song would carry its name and the memory of their captivity into every corner of the future world. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus is where most tellings stop. But the city did not stop. It did not fall silent that night, or that century, or for centuries after. The conquest by Persia was not the death of Babylon. It was the beginning of a long, slow, golden twilight that lasted astonishingly for several hundred more years, and that contains some of the most poignant scenes in the whole story. For the great city did not vanish when it lost its independence. It simply became what very old, very great cities so often become. No longer the capital of an empire, but a jewel in someone else's crown. Too important, too holy, too magnificent to destroy. Kept and honored and administered by a succession of foreign masters, gently declining century by century beneath its own enormous past. Under the Persians, Babylon remained one of the principal cities of the largest empire the world had ever seen. A royal residence, an administrative capital, the wealthiest province in the Persian system, its temples maintained, its scholars still watching the stars, its scribes still pressing wedges into clay. The Persian kings styled themselves kings of Babylon among their many titles. The astronomical observations continued unbroken on the temple roofs. The Akitu was at least sometimes restored. Life went on rich and ancient and increasingly antiquarian. In the shadow of Nebuchadnezzar's walls, and then 2 centuries after Cyrus, came the conqueror who would inherit it all. A young Macedonian king who, having shattered the Persian Empire in a handful of years, marched into Babylon in the year 331, before the Common Era, and fell in love with it. Alexander the Great entered Babylon, not as a destroyer, but as a worshipper. He sacrificed to Marduk. He ordered the rebuilding of the great Zigguratani, the tower toward heaven, which had fallen into disrepair. Though the work of clearing the old rubble was so immense that it was barely begun, he intended, it seems, to make Babylon the capital of his vast new empire, the center of a world that would stretch from Greece to India, to restore the gate of the god to the mastery of the earth with himself on its throne. And then in the year 323, before the Common Era, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, at the age of just 32, Alexander the Great fell ill after a long night of drinking, and after some days of fever died. The conqueror of the world died in the bedchamber of the greatest of the Babylonian kings in the past, and Nebuchadnezzar had built his dream of a Babylonian world capital dying with him. The Babylonian astronomers, faithful to the end, recorded it in their diary of the heavens among the positions of the planets and the level of the river. A brief, flat clay note that the king died the 29th day clouds the master of the earth, reduced to a line in a Babylonian weather and omen report. There is no more Babylonian way to die or to be remembered. After Alexander, the long twilight deepened toward night. His generals carved up his empire, and Babylon fell to the line of Seleucus, one of those generals who founded a dynasty to rule the eastern conquests, and the Seleucids did the thing that more than any conquest finally killed Babylon, not by violence, but by building a rival. Seleucid, a new capital. A brand new Greek-style city not far away, on the Tigris Sokia and into the Bok. New city by royal policy and by the simple gravity of where power and money now flowed. The life of Babylon slowly drained. Populations were resettled. The administration moved. The trade shifted to the new river port. Babylon was not destroyed. It was far more cruelly made redundant. The great city began to empty quarter by quarter as people drifted to where the future was. The temples still functioned, tended by an ever smaller, ever poorer, ever more antiquarian priesthood. The astronomers still watched the sky and kept their diaries, the last unbroken thread of the old world, recording eclipses and planets into the 1st century before the Common Era and perhaps beyond. The very last cuneiform tablets we possess, the final wedge marks pressed into clay before the 3,000-year-old script fell silent forever. Our Babylonian astronomical texts, the stargazers writing down the heavens to the very end, long after almost everyone else had gone, and then even the writing stops. The last datable cuneiform tablet of any kind comes from the 1st century of the Common Era, an astronomical almanac. Fittingly, the sky observed to the last. After that, silence. The knowledge of how to read the script died with the last priests who knew it. The temples crumbled. The great walls, no longer maintained, slumped back toward the mud they were made of. The canals silted closed. The overwatered land grew salt and barren, as the rivers, no longer governed, took back their ancient freedom. The bricks of Nebuchadnezzar's palaces and temples were carried away century after century by local people to build their villages as they would be carried away well into modern times. The site became a wilderness of low brown mounds beside a shifting river, Babel. The local people still called the mounds, holding the ghost of the name long after everything else was gone. And travelers who passed that way in later centuries, hearing that this was the site of Babylon, could scarcely believe it. A few eroded hillocks, some broken brickwork, a desolation of dust where the wonder of the world had stood. The prophet's ancient curses seemed at last to have come true. The great city become a heap, a dwelling place for wild beasts, the haunt of jackals, never to be inhabited again. The gate of the god had become a synonym for ruin, exactly as Nineveh had, exactly as all the proud cities of the plain had. One after another, across the long, patient indifference of the centuries, Babylon died the way cities truly die. Not usually, in a single night of fire and judgment, however much the legends prefer it so, but slowly, quietly, by being left, by the moving on of the world, by the silting of the canals, and the creeping of the salt, and the carrying away of the bricks, one cartload at a time, by people who no longer remembered, or had never known, whose city they were carrying off to mend, their walls. And yet here is the strangest turn of all, the turn that this whole night has been circling toward. Even as the real Babylon sank into the mud and was forgotten, a second Babylon was rising, more enduring than the first, built not of brick, but of meaning. And that second Babylon would become one of the most powerful symbols in the history of the human priest, casting its shadow across 2,000 years of art and prophecy and dream. Long after a single living soul had forgotten where the first one stood, it began, as we have seen, with the exiles, with the people of Judah, who turned the city of their captivity into a symbol of all worldly pride, all oppression, all the glittering power that sets itself against heaven and is doomed to fall. The prophets had thundered against Babylon, and when the early Christians centuries later suffered under a new empire, they reached for the old name to speak of it without speaking its name. And so in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Christian Bible, Rome itself is veiled under the name of Babylon, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, drunk on the blood of the saints, the great city of 7 hills, whose fall is foretold in language of terrible splendor. Babylon the Great is fallen, and the merchants of the earth weep over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more. The of Babylon, seated on her scarlet beast, became one of the central images of the Western imagination, a figure for every corrupt and gorgeous worldly power, painted and printed and preached for 2,000 years. And the real Babylon, the actual brown mounds beside the Euphrates, had nothing to do with any of it. The name had come entirely loose from the place. Babylon had become a word for a thing, for the city of man in all its pride, set against the city of God, for luxury and corruption and the doomed magnificence of the world, for exile and longing and the loss of home, for the confusion of tongues and the folly of overreach. Rastafarians would call the whole oppressive Western system Babylon. Poets and songwriters beyond counting would invoke the rivers of Babylon, the fall of Babylon, the gardens of Babylon, none of them meaning the place, all of them meaning the idea. The first Babylon was a city of 200,000 people on a hot plain. The second Babylon is a city the size of the imagination, and it has never fallen, because it was never built of anything that can fall. It is the most successful city humanity ever made, in a way, for it conquered the future so completely that most of the people who say its name have no idea there was ever a real one at all. There is a deep and gentle irony in this, to carry toward sleep. Nebuchadnezzar built his walls and his gate and his tower to make his name eternal, and they crumbled into the mud within a few centuries, and his name survived chiefly as the villain of his captive stories. The Babylonians built their ziggurat to touch heaven, to be the wonder of the world, and it became in the mouths of their enemies the Tower of Babel, the very emblem of human folly. The city tried with all its might to be remembered as the gate of the god, the center of the world, the unconquerable wonder, and it is remembered instead as the fallen city, the place of exile and confusion and pride struck down. Babylon got its immortality. It simply got it in the shape its enemies and its captives gave it, not the shape it built for itself, which is perhaps the most Babylonian fate of all. For a city whose own name began as a misheard word, made holy by a pun, we almost never get to choose how we are remembered. Babylon, which wanted so badly to be remembered, and which tried so hard, and which built such wonders to ensure it, Babylon, least of all, before we leave the living city for its long twilight. We must sit a while with the book that Babylon read, for a civilization is known not only by its walls, but by its stories, and the people of the plain possessed a story so old and so deep that it may be the oldest great story humanity has written down. And it was Babylon, above all, that gave it its lasting form. It is the epic of Gilgamesh, and to hear it, even in fragments in the dark, is to listen to the human heart speaking across more than 4,000 years in a voice we still astonishingly understand. Gilgamesh was a king, a real one perhaps, a half-legendary ruler of the Sumerian city of Uk in the deep dawn of history, who across the centuries grew in story until he became the hero of an epic that was copied and recopied in Sumerian and then in Babylonian Akkadian for 2,000 years. The great classic of Mesopotamian literature, studied in the schools, treasured in the libraries, the version we know best, assembled and polished in the long Babylonian centuries. And the story it tells is not in the end about war or conquest or the founding of cities. It is about death and the refusal to accept it, and the slow, terrible wisdom of accepting it at last. It is 4,000 years before the phrase existed. The first story about the fear of dying, which is to say, it is about the one thing that has not changed at all between those people and us. The epic opens with Gilgamesh as a young king, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, magnificent and unbearable, so full of restless strength that he oppresses his own city, and the people cry out to the gods for relief. And the gods answer by making him an equal, a companion. Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe, raised among the animals, who is civilized by a woman and brought to the city, and who meets Gilgamesh, and wrestles him to a standstill and becomes, instead of his rival, the friend of his heart, the other half of his soul. And the great central movement of the epic is the love between these two men, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who go out together to perform heroic deeds, to kill the monster Habara in the cedar forest, to slay the bull of heaven. The friendship of two young men who believe, as the young believe, that they are immortal, that their strength and their bond can master anything, that death is a thing that happens to other people, and then Enkidu dies. The gods, offended by the hero's pride, decree that one of them must die, and it is Enkidu who sickens and wastes and dies slowly, terrified, cursing and weeping, while Gilgamesh sits helpless beside him, and the death of his friend breaks Gilgamesh open. He cannot accept it. He will not leave the body. The epic says he would not give Enkidu up for burial until a worm fell out of the corpse. Would not believe, could not believe, that this warmth and this voice and this beloved face were simply gone. And in his grief and his terror, for if Enkidu can die, then so can he. Gilgamesh abandons his kingdom and his city and goes wandering into the wilderness, ragged and wild, dressed in skins, searching the edges of the world for the one thing he now wants more than glory or kingship, the secret of eternal life. He has seen death's face, and he is running from it across the whole earth. His search brings him at last, after terrible journeys, to the one man who is said to have escaped death. A man named Utnapishtim, who lives at the edge of the world, immortal, granted eternal life by the gods. And Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh his story, and his story is the flood. Long ago, he says, the gods resolved to destroy humanity with a great deluge, but the god of wisdom warned Utanishim and told him to build a great boat and to take aboard his family and the seed of all living things. And the flood came and rained down for days until all of humanity was turned back to clay, and even the gods were terrified by what they had unleashed, and cowered like dogs against the wall of heaven. And the boat came to rest at last upon a mountain, and Utmishtum sent out a dove, and then a swallow, and then a raven, and the raven did not return, for it had found dry land. And Utmishtum came out and made sacrifice, and the gods, grieving and grateful, granted him eternal life. You will recognize it. You have heard it before in another book, with another name: Noah, the ark, the 40 days, the dove and the raven, and the mountain and the sacrifice. The flood story of Gilgamesh is older by many centuries than the flood of Genesis, and when a scholar in the British Museum first deciphered it from a broken Babylonian tablet in 1370s, and realized he was reading the story of Noah's flood in cuneiform form, 1,000 years older than the Bible, he is said to have leapt up and begun tearing off his clothes in the wild excitement of the discovery. The flood that drowns the world, the boat that saves the seed of life, the bird sent out to find land. It is one of the oldest stories humanity owns, and Babylon was its keeper. But the flood is not the answer Gilgamesh sought. For Utnapishtim's immortality was a one-time gift of the gods, never to be repeated, and it cannot be given to Gilgamesh. And so the hero, after all his searching, must learn the hardest thing, that there is no escape, that the gods kept eternal life for themselves when they made humankind, that death is the share and the destiny of every mortal thing. He is given one last chance, a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, that can at least restore lost youth, and he dives for it and wins it. And then, on the journey home, while he bathes in a pool, a serpent steals it and eats it, and sheds its skin and slips away renewed. And Gilgamesh sits down and weeps, because even that small mercy is lost, because the snakes get to begin again, and the people do not. And then this is the wisdom the whole long epic exists to reach. He goes home, he comes back to his own city, the city he abandoned, and the epic ends where a lesser story would have begun, with the hero standing before the walls of his city and looking at them, really looking at them for the first time. Look at these walls, he says, in effect, to the boatman who has brought him home. Look how well they are made. Look at the city. Look at the works of human hands. He has not found eternal life. He has found the only immortality a mortal can have, the work, the city, the walls that will outlast him, the things made and the things loved, and the life lived in the time that was given, however short. The man who could not accept that his friend was grass learns at the last to accept that he too is grass, and to find in that acceptance not despair, but a kind of peace, and a reason to go home and rule well and build well in the days that remain. It is, I think, the most moving thing the ancient world left us, and it is pure Babylon, kept, copied, treasured, studied in the schools of the city for 2,000 years, the story they read to understand themselves, and its lesson is the lesson of the whole night. The lesson the river has been murmuring under everything, that the wall falls, and the king dies, and the gardens wither, and even the gate of the god goes back to the mud, and that the only thing to be done about it, the only wisdom there is to build well anyway, and love well anyway, and live well in the time the water lends us, and let the rest go down as it must, as it always has, as it will. Gilgamesh went looking for the secret of not dying. What he found, and what he brought home, was the secret of living, which is the only secret there is. He found his walls beautiful. He went home. He was content to be mortal at last. There are worse things to fall asleep on than that. Let us spend one more hour among the ordinary people of Babylon. Before we let the city go, not the kings and the gods this time, but the frightened and the sick, and the ones who lay awake at night, because in their fears and their remedies we come closest of all, to touching them as kin, since the night and its terrors have not changed so very much in 4,000 years. The people of Babylon lived in a world thick with unseen powers. Behind the orderly cosmos of Marduk and the great gods lay a swarming half-world of lesser spirits, ghosts, and demons, who were the cause, the Babylonians believed, of most of the misfortune that fell upon a person, sickness above all, but also bad luck, nightmares, quarrels, impotence, the failure of crops, the death of children. There were demons of disease with terrible names. Lamashtu, the lion-headed she-demon, who slipped into the houses of pregnant women and mothers to steal the newborn and bring the fevers of childbirth, against whom women wore amulets and hung plaques of an even more frightful demon, Bizuzu, a grotesque figure with a canine face and bulging eyes and a scaled body and the talons of a bird, the king of the wind demons, set to guard the threshold on the ancient principle that the best protection against a monster is a worse monster facing outward. There were the spirits of the restless dead, the ghosts of those who had not been properly buried, or whose names no one remembered, who returned to torment the living, seizing them by the hand, bringing headache and wasting and madness, who had to be fed and named and laid to rest with careful rituals. There was the evil eye, and the curse, and the spell of a malicious neighbor. The night especially belonged to these powers. The dark was when they walked, when the sick grew worse, and the frightened grew more frightened. And a great body of Babylonian prayer and ritual is addressed precisely to the terrors of the night. Incantations to be recited against bad dreams, against the demons of the dark hours, against the fear that comes when the lamp burns low and the house is quiet and something you are sure is moving in the shadows. You know that fear? Everyone who has ever lain awake in the dark knows it. It is 4,000 years old at the very least, and the Babylonians wrote it down. And against all this, they had their healers. And the healers came in two kinds, working side by side, which tells us something true and strange about the Babylonian mind. There was the Ashipu, the exorcist or magical healer who diagnosed which demon or ghost or angry god was responsible for an illness, and who treated it with incantations, rituals, amulets, prayers, and the symbolic transfer of the sickness into a substitute, a clay figure, an animal that could be destroyed or driven away. And there was the Azu, the physician in something closer to our sense, who treated the body directly with a vast pharmacopoeia of herbs and minerals and animal products, with bandages and piccases and potions, with diets and washes and salves, prescriptions for which survive in great number on the tablets, listing symptoms and remedies with careful empirical attention. If a man's head is hot and his eyes are yellow, you shall grind such and such a plant, and mix it with such, and bind it on, and he shall recover. The two kinds of healer were not rivals so much as colleagues. A sick person might call both, the exorcist to address the spiritual cause, and the physician to treat the physical symptom, the prayer and the pus applied together, the demon driven out the door, while the herb was bound on the brow. It is easy to smile at the demons and the amulets from the comfort of our own age, but pause in the dark and consider. They watched and they recorded, and they accumulated across centuries an enormous body of careful observation about which plants eased which symptoms, what the course of which diseases was, how the body behaved. The same patient accumulating recording habit of mind that turned upon the sky gave us astronomy, the Babylonian physician mixing his herbs against a fever, while the exorcist chanted against the demon that sent it, stands at the very headquarters of medicine, doing what healers have always done and still do, gathering what works, passing it on, and standing with whatever tools the age affords, prayer, or peltus, or pill. Between the frightened human being and the dark, and over the sickbed, and over the cradle, and over the threshold of the sleeping house, hung the amulets and the little gods, the grimacing Pazuzu facing outward into the night, the prayers pressed into clay and built into the walls, the figurines of protective spirits buried beneath the floor, all of it the work of people doing the oldest and most human thing of all, trying to keep the ones they loved safe through the dangerous dark until morning. They did not have our medicines or our explanations. They had their herbs and their incantations, and their fierce little demon guardians and their love, which was the same as ours. And when their children were sick in the night, they sat up with them and tried everything they knew and prayed to whatever might be listening, and watched the lamp and waited for the light. Exactly as we do. 4,000 years the walls have fallen, and the gods are forgotten, and the script fell silent. But the mother, sitting up with the feverish child in the small hours, willing the dawn to come, is not gone at all. She is in every house tonight, she always was. That is the deepest thing the mud gave back to us. Not the wonders, but the sameness, the proof pressed in clay, that they were us, that we are them, that the human night with all its terrors and all its tenderness is one long unbroken thing, and we are merely its latest watchers, holding the same vigil they held against the same dark, for the same reason, before we follow the diggers down into the mounds to recover the lost city. Let us gather in one place the inheritance, the things that Babylon and its Mesopotamian world handed forward to us, often so quietly and so long ago that we use them every day without the faintest idea where they came from. For the deepest way Babylon survived is not as a name or a legend at all, but as the invisible furniture of our own minds, the inherited tools we think with and never notice. Begin with time itself. Look at a clock or a watch or the corner of any screen. The hours are divided into 60 minutes and the minutes into 60 seconds, and that division, that strange non-dimal 60ness that runs through all our measurement of time, is Babylonian, inherited from the base 60 counting of the Sumerians before them, pressed into clay on the plain between the rivers 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, and never since abandoned. Every time you check the time, you are using a Babylonian number. Look at any measurement of angle, any circle, any map, any compass. 360 degrees to the circle, 60 minutes to the degree. Babylonian, the same 60. The legacy of the rooftop astronomers who divided the sky. Look at the night sky itself, or at the horoscope column, or at the way people speak of being a Leo, or a Scorpio. The 12 signs of the zodiac, the band of constellations through which the sun and moon and planets move, were defined and named on the temple roofs of Mesopotamia and the whole vast edifice of astrology, and through it, the beginnings of astronomy descends from the Babylonian conviction that the heavens were a text written for us to read. The 7-day week, some argue, carries echoes of the Babylonian reckoning of time by the moon and the planets. The very idea of the scientific record of observing carefully writing it down, and building knowledge across generations as one of its great sources here in the unbroken centuries of star diaries kept on the temple roofs. Then the law, the idea so fundamental to us that we can hardly imagine its absence, that there should be written laws, public, fixed, knowable in advance. The same for the case today as for the case tomorrow. Rather than the mere whim of whoever holds power, is one whose great early monument is Hammurabi, Black Pillar, and whose roots run back through older Sumerian codes. The principle that even the king is subject to a higher law, that he holds his power in trust, and answers for its use. That the whole purpose of authority is that the strong shall not oppress the weak. These ideas, carved in stone 4,000 years ago, are among the deep ancestors of every constitution, and every charter of rights since. The notion of justice as proportion, the punishment fitting the crime, the regulation of commerce and contract and liability, the protection, however imperfect, of the weak and the wronged, the long river of law that runs through all later civilization has one of its springs on this plane. Then the machinery of economic life, money as a measured standard of value, the written contract, the loan at interest, the promissory note, debt and credit and accounting, worked out in the counting houses of Sumer and Babylon, and handed forward into the foundations of all later commerce. Then the stories, the flood, and the ark, and the dove, and the raven, the creation from watery chaos, and the dividing of the waters, and the making of humankind from clay, the garden, the serpent, the loss, the tower of overweening pride, the deep mythic patterns that flowed from Mesopotamia into the Hebrew Bible, and through it into the imagination of half the world, then writing itself, the mother of all of it, the first writing on earth, without which none of the rest could have been kept or carried at all. It is an astonishing inheritance to come from a single corner of the earth. Time and the circle and the zodiac, law and justice and the written code, money and contract and interest, the flood and the creation and the tower, and writing beneath everything. And it is the truest answer to the question of whether Babylon really fell. The walls fell, the gate was carried to a museum, the gods are forgotten, and the script went silent for 2,000 years. But the hours of your day are Babylonian, and the degrees of the circle, and the signs of the zodiac, and the deep shape of your laws, and the machinery of your money, and the oldest stories in the book on your shelf. And in that sense, the gate of the god never closed at all. We live in 100 unnoticed ways, inside the mind of Babylon, still thinking with its numbers, ruled by the descendants of its laws, telling its stories, keeping its hours. The city sank into the mud. The civilization never died. It just stopped having a name, and became instead the water we all swim in, invisible, inherited everywhere, the deep foundation under the foundation, the gift of the plain between the rivers, to every age that came after, including tonight our own. For more than 2,000 years, then Babylon was twice buried once under the mud of the plain, and buried again more deeply under the legend of itself. The second Babylon of prophecy and dream, so thick over the first that hardly anyone remembered. There had been a real city of brick and people under all that meaning. The travelers who crossed the plain in the long centuries between knew only that somewhere here, among the desolate mounds, the local people called Babel, the ancient wonder had stood, but the script was unreadable, the language forgotten, the history known only through the hostile fragments of the Bible, and the second-hand wonder of the Greeks, the real Babylon, the Babylon of Hammurabi's laws, and the astronomers' diaries, of the New Year procession, and the surgeon's fee, and the schoolboy's homework, had vanished as completely as if it had never been. It survived only as an accusation and a marvel, the wonder, with nothing of the living city left at all. And then in the 19th century of the Common Era, human beings learned once again to read. It is one of the great adventures of the human mind, the recovery of the ancient Near East, and it deserves a moment of wonder, even at this late and drowsy hour. Travelers and adventurers and early archaeologists began in the 1800s to dig into the mounds of Mesopotamia, at Nineveh first, where they hauled the carved Assyrian kings and their winged bulls and their libraries of clay tablets out of the earth into an astonished Europe, and at Babylon, where in the early 20th century a meticulous German expedition under the POV, archaeologist Robert Kulawi, dug for years and uncovered the foundations of the legend, the Great Walls, the processional way, the foundation of the ziggurat, and above all, the shattered glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate, which were carried to Berlin, and patiently, piece by way, piece reassembled into the blue and golden wonder that stands there yet. And meanwhile, in the studies and museums of Europe, scholars performed an even greater feat. They cracked the cuneiform script through patient genius, working from trilingual inscriptions, guessing and testing and arguing across decades. They learned to read again the wedge marks that no human being had understood for nearly 2,000 years. And as the script gave up its secrets, the lost world came flooding back. Not the legend, but the reality. The hundreds of thousands of clay tablets that the dry climate and the unburnable medium had preserved. The laws, the letters, the contracts, the star diaries, the school exercises, the love poems, the king lists, the creation epic, the flood story, the whole teeming documentary record of the oldest civilization on Earth, springing back into legibility after 2 millennia of silence. We can read now the homework of a Babylonian child, and the complaint of a Babylonian customer about the poor quality of his copper, and the prayer of a Babylonian mother for a sick son. The astronomers note that the king died the 29th day, clouds the mud that the rivers laid down, and that the people of the plain wrote upon because they had nothing else turned out to be the most faithful keeper of memory the ancient world possessed. And it gave back, when at last we learned again, to read it, not the great, and not the Tower of Folly, but living city, ordinary, magnificent, human, real. There is a justice in it that completes the long circle of our night. Babylon was remembered for millennia only in the words of its enemies and captives, as the city of pride, the city of exile, the city that fell, and then the earth itself, and the patient mud, and the unkillable clay gave the city back its own voice at last. After 2,000 years of being spoken for, we can hear it now faintly under the legend, not boasting, not threatening, not the awe, the wonder, but simply the murmur of 100,000 people living their lives by a slow river, under a hot sky, watching the stars, keeping their records, raising their children, lifting the water one more day. That is the real Babylon, recovered from the mud, and it was worth all the digging to hear it. And so the long night closes, and the lamp we lowered into the well of time so many hours ago comes, up again slowly into the dark, and it is time to let it all go down, gently, the way the silt goes down, through still water, after the boat has passed. Look back before sleep, at the whole of the river we have traveled. We began on its dark bank with the blue gate, glowing out of the haze of the plain, and a city so old that it was ancient to the ancients. We followed it down from the very beginning, from a misheard name, made holy by a pun, a nothing town in the shadow of older cities, waiting upstream while the Sumerians built the world. We watched a patient Amorite king named Hammurabi wait 30 years and then take the plain in 5 and carve into black stone the surgeons and the boatmen and the tavern keepers of his world, and asked to be remembered as a shepherd. We watched the city fall and rise, drowned by Sennacherib, and raised by his own son's son, the unkillable holy city of the plain. We watched the shadow of Assyria lengthen, and then in a single furious generation vanish forever in the flames of Nineveh, and free Babylon inherit the world. We walked at last into the golden city, under the blue dragons of the Ishtar Gate, down the processional way, past the glazed lions, beneath the tower that touched heaven, past the green impossible gardens hanging in the desert air, through streets where 70 tongues were spoken, and 200,000 people lived at the center of the world. We climbed to the rooftops where the stargazers, seeking the gods, found the universe, and gave us the hours and the degrees and the signs of the zodiac. We sat by the rivers with the weeping exiles of Judah, who lost everything and saved their soul in words, and made of their captivity a song that has outlived every wall the city raised. And we watched the end come, not in the night of fire that the legend loves, but softly, strangely, a great city, losing its nerve in a quarrel with its God, opening its gates to a liberator, slipping then into the long twilight under Persians and Greeks, emptying quarter by quarter as the world moved on. The stargazers, writing down the heavens to the very last, until the script fell silent, and the court slumped into mud, and the bricks were carried away to mend the villages of people who had forgotten whose city they were carrying off. What remains of Babylon then, at the very last, here, on the edge of sleep? Everything that matters, and almost nothing that the city would have chosen. The Blue Gate stands rebuilt in a northern museum, its dragons pacing still. The Black Pillar of Hammurabi stands in another, its laws still legible. The wronged man, still able, after 4,000 years, to come before the King of Justice and have his rights read out. The hours on your clock are Babylonian. The degrees of the circle are Babylonian. The 12 signs through which the sun moves are Babylonian, dreamed up on a temple roof 3,000 years ago by men watching for the will of the gods. The song by the rivers is sung in 100 languages still. The Tower of Babel still stands in every warning about pride and every story about the confusion of tongues, though not one brick of the real one is left stacked on another. And the name itself, Babylon, the gate of the god, the great, the fallen city, the lost wonder, the place of exile and longing and overreaching dreams. The name goes on doing its ancient work in the human heart, meaning the city of man in all its glory and all its doom. The magnificence that overreaches, the splendor that forgets it is grass. For that in the end is what Babylon became, what it was made into by its captives and its enemies, and the long indifferent centuries, a mirror. Every age looks into the name of Babylon and sees its own pride, its own power, its own fear of falling. The Hebrews saw their captivity in it, the Christians saw imperial Rome, the prophets saw all worldly power doomed before the divine, and we lying here in the dark, in our own great age, of glittering cities and towers that truly do reach toward heaven, of empires that believe themselves unconquerable, of wonders we have built and named and are wondered at across the earth. We may see, if we are honest, and the hour is late enough, something of ourselves. Is not this great Babylon that I have built, said the king on his rooftop, looking out over the wonder of his making. And the oldest story in the world says, be careful, be gentle with your wonders, hold your gold lightly. The river that built you is patient, and it is older than you. And one day, when the digging stops, it will quietly take its country back. There is no malice in it. There is only the long patience of the water, and the mud that remembers everything, and the slow turning of a world that built Babylon and forgot it and dug it up again, and will in time forget us too, and remember us, perhaps only in the words we leave. So let them be kind words if we can manage it. Let them be honest. Let them be worth the digging. Sleep now. The gate is blue, and the dragons are pacing, and the lions walk the long road in the torchlight, and the stargazers are on the roof, writing down the heavens, and the river is going by in the dark, slow and patient and warm. The same river, every drop of it, that ran past the walls of the oldest city in the world. You do not need to remember any of it. It has been carried this far without your help, 4,000 years from the mud to your pillow, and it will carry itself the rest of the way into morning. Let the names be water. Let the kings be water. Let the whole patient flood of it carry you down and under and home. The river will keep till morning. So will the city. So, sleeper, will you sleep now. Carry the gate with you glowing blue into the dark. The water remembers everything and forgives it and goes. If you enjoyed this journey through deep time, you'll probably like where we go next. So, please tap like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And in the comments, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now?